A man who spent his life building an empire with blood and tears, only to destroy the most precious thing he possessed with his own hands. 20 years ago, Vincent Moretti drove the woman he loved out of his life, taking their unborn child with her, because of an accusation he never verified. Today, a mysterious commander is slowly wiping out the entire kingdom Vincent spent his life building. And the most terrifying thing isn't that he's losing. The most terrifying thing is that the one defeating him has his own eyes. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't leave, because the truth will change everything. The city never really slept. It just changed shifts. After midnight, the port district shed its working-class skin and became something older, something that operated on rules no city ordinance had ever acknowledged. The loading cranes stood motionless against the sky like iron sentinels that had long since stopped caring what moved beneath them. The harbor water was black and still and smelled of diesel and brine, and the sound of it lapping against the concrete pilings was the only sound for 3 blocks in any direction, until the black SUVs came rolling in without headlights, engines barely above idle, tires whispering over cracked asphalt. Ethan Carter counted them from the rooftop of a decommissioned cold storage facility 400 meters north. 3 vehicles, 2 in front, 1 trailing. Standard Moretti convoy configuration. He'd memorized the pattern 6 weeks ago when he first started mapping their supply chain movements, and they hadn't changed it since, which told him one of 2 things. Either they were confident no one was watching, or they were arrogant enough not to care. In his experience with organizations like this one, it was always both. He pressed the earpiece tighter and kept his voice flat. Convoys on schedule. 3 units. Probable 8 to 10 bodies total. I've got visual on the lead driver. It's Caruso. Caruso. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Webb, Ethan's second in command and the closest thing he had to a friend, which wasn't saying much. That's unexpected. That's a senior man for a routine supply run. It's not a routine supply run. Silence on the line. Then, how long have you known? Since this morning. Ethan shifted his weight on the gravel, keeping the crosshairs of his scope steady on the lead vehicle. The manifest they filed with the Port Authority is a cover. There are no machine parts in those trucks. I intercepted a secondary communication through the dock workers' union. There are people in there, Marcus. Families. At least 2 dozen. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Change of plan? Marcus asked. Change of plan. He pulled back from the scope and moved across the rooftop in a low crouch, assembling the pieces of this operation in his head the way he used to assemble tactical overlays in the military. Quickly, without sentiment, stripping out everything that wasn't essential. He'd spent 11 months dismantling the Moretti Syndicate's eastern operations, piece by piece, from the money laundering infrastructure to the street-level distribution networks to the political connections that kept the organization insulated from prosecution. He'd done it with a small team, no official jurisdiction, and a budget that would have made a federal task force laugh. And he'd done it because his mother had spent the better part of 2 decades in hiding, moving from city to city, working jobs that paid cash and left no paper trail, raising him in the margins of a country that had no idea she existed, all because of a man named Vincent Moretti. He didn't let himself think about that now. Thinking about it made him sloppy. Pull Chen and Reyes off the eastern gate and redirect them to the secondary dock entrance. I want them in position before those trucks stop rolling. Non-lethal if possible. I need the cargo compartments opened without panic. He paused at the edge of the rooftop, calculating the drop to the fire escape below. And get Diaz on the line with the trafficking task force. Anonymous tip, untraceable. They need to be ready to receive. They'll ask questions. They always do. Tell them nothing. He went over the edge, non-down. The drop was 12 feet onto a rusted fire escape landing that groaned under his weight and sent a shower of flaked metal down into the alley below. He absorbed the impact through his knees and kept moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time, not running, but not wasting a second either. The cold air hit his face, and he could smell rain coming in off the water, maybe an hour out. The timing would help. Rain kept civilians indoors, and it gave his people better cover. By the time he reached ground level, the convoy had stopped at the secondary loading bay, 200 meters to his south. He moved along the fence line, staying in the shadow of the concrete wall, and watched through a gap in the chain link as the lead vehicle's door opened and a man got out. Sal Caruso was 53 years old, built like a refrigerator that had been left out in bad weather, and he carried himself with the particular kind of confidence that came from decades of having other men step back when he entered a room. He wore a gray overcoat and no hat, and he stood in the cold air looking at the dock like a man checking on an investment, which was exactly what he was doing. He said something to the driver, short and sharp, and the driver nodded and moved toward the second truck. Ethan pressed himself flat against the fence and activated his comm. Chen. Status. In position. Secondary entrance is clear. I've got eyes on the rear of truck 2. Looks like a standard cargo lock, nothing reinforced. Reyes? North side, ready. Hold until the bay doors are open and Caruso moves inside. I want him contained, not cornered. Cornered men do stupid things. He watched Caruso pace the length of the first truck, hands in his coat pockets, breath misting in the cold. There was something practiced about the man's movements, something that spoke of long habit. The way he scanned without appearing to scan, the way he positioned himself with his back never fully to any open space. Even now, standing in what he believed was a secure location, Sal Caruso was working. It was almost impressive. Almost. The bay doors rolled open from inside, and a wash of yellow light spilled out onto the dock. 2 men in work clothes appeared in the doorway, and Caruso moved toward them, exchanging words that Ethan couldn't hear at this distance. Then all 3 disappeared inside. Go, Ethan said. It took 4 minutes. That was the span of time between Ethan's command and the moment Sal Caruso found himself sitting on the cold concrete floor of the loading bay with his hands zip-tied behind his back and a very calm young man crouching in front of him with no weapon drawn, which somehow made the whole situation feel worse than if the weapon had been drawn. Caruso stared at Ethan with the flat, assessing gaze of a man trying to calculate his way out of something. He'd been disarmed efficiently. Ethan's people were good. They were always good. They never wasted motion. And the 2 men who'd been waiting inside were similarly secured against the far wall, not roughly, but with the kind of practiced competence that made struggling feel pointless. The truck compartments were open. The families inside, both 27 people, as it turned out, 11 of them children, had been moved to a secured area at the north end of the building where Marcus was managing the handoff, speaking quietly into a phone, keeping his voice level and unhurried. Ethan could hear the sound of children crying softly somewhere behind him, and he made himself not look. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Caruso said. His voice was steady. Ethan gave him credit for that. Sal Caruso. Born 1972 in South Philly. Father was a numbers runner, mother worked in a textile factory. You were recruited into the Moretti organization at 19, made your bones handling collection disputes in the Kensington corridor, and you've been Vincent Moretti's chief of logistics for the past 16 years. Ethan tilted his head slightly. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is whether you understand who you're dealing with. Caruso's eyes didn't waver. You're a dead man. Whatever you think you're running here, whatever game this is, you're a dead man. People keep saying that. Ethan straightened up. They're usually wrong. Not this time. Caruso leaned forward slightly, the zip ties pulling at his wrists. You think Moretti doesn't know about you? You think 11 months of picking at the edges of his operation hasn't registered? He knows your face, Carter. He knows your name. And he is not a patient man. Ethan felt something move through him at that. Not fear, exactly. Something colder. The use of his name, spoken by this man, in this place, felt like a door opening onto a room he'd been trying to keep closed. He kept his face neutral. Then tell him he's running out of Empire to protect. He turned toward the bay exit. Task force will be here in 8 minutes. If you're smart, you'll talk to them. If you're not, he paused without turning back. Well, the families in that truck will testify regardless. He walked out into the night air. The rain had started, light and cold, speckling the concrete dark. The debrief happened in the back of a panel van parked 6 blocks from the harbor, the kind of vehicle that disappeared in any neighborhood because it looked like it could belong to an electrician or a plumber or anyone who worked with their hands. Marcus sat across from Ethan with a tablet balanced on his knee and the expression he always wore after an operation, carefully neutral, the way a man looks when he's processing something he hasn't decided how to feel about yet. 27, Marcus said. That's the largest single recovery we've made. Yes. And Caruso is in federal custody. For now. Ethan looked out the van's tinted rear window at the street. The rain was heavier now, blurring the lights. He'll have a lawyer inside of 2 hours. Whether they hold him depends on what the families say and whether the task force can move fast enough to freeze his assets before the syndicate's legal team starts filing. We sent them everything we had. We sent them what we can prove. There's a difference. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the fatigue that he'd been holding off for the past 18 hours begin to push through. The operation hurt them. The trafficking revenue out of this port was significant, and we've shut it down, at least temporarily. But we haven't touched Vincent. Marcus set the tablet down on the van's floor. He was quiet for a moment, which with Marcus meant he was working up to something. Ethan waited. You got a name tonight, Marcus said. Caruso knew your name. I heard him. That's a significant change. For 11 months, you've been a ghost to these people, a pattern of disruptions they couldn't identify, couldn't locate, couldn't get ahead of. Now someone in their organization has connected the dots. Marcus paused. That changes your exposure. It changes everything, Ethan said, with a flatness that didn't invite argument. He'd known, of course, that the anonymity wouldn't hold indefinitely. Organizations as large and entrenched as the Moretti Syndicate had information networks that eventually caught up with anyone who worked against them long enough. The surprise wasn't that they'd identified him. The surprise was the undercurrent of something in Caruso's voice when he said the name. Not just threat, but something else. Something that felt almost like recognition, like the name meant more than just target. He filed it away. He was good at filing things away. Get some sleep, Marcus said. We have the Delgado meeting in the morning, and you look like something a dog dragged in. Thanks, Marcus. Just being accurate. Woke. Ethan Carter had not been born in the city, but he'd grown up in enough cities that he'd stopped distinguishing between them by the time he was 12. What he remembered instead were the quality of light in different apartments, the specific sounds of different neighborhoods settling at night, the way his mother moved through unfamiliar spaces, always with one eye toward the exits, always with her keys already in her hand. Naomi Carter had been, by any measure, an extraordinary woman. She was also a woman who'd been shaped by fear into something that looked like strength from the outside, and Ethan had been old enough eventually to understand the difference. She'd raised him on discipline and silence, and the particular kind of love that doesn't have room to be sentimental because it's too busy being vigilant. She'd taught him to read people before they could read him. She'd taught him to be invisible when he needed to be invisible, and visible only when he chose to be. She'd never told him his father's name, not when he was a child asking the way children ask, with the blunt innocence of someone who doesn't yet know that some questions are shaped like knives. Not when he was a teenager pushing back against the restrictions of their life. The careful anonymity, the reluctance to put down roots, the way she flinched at certain names in news reports. Not when he was 22 and shipping out with the army and she'd stood at the departure terminal with dry eyes and a jaw set so tight he could see the muscles working in her face, and she'd hugged him once, hard, and said only, survive. He had. For 4 years he'd survived things that had taken better men. Smarter men, more careful men. And he'd come back from it understanding something about himself that he hadn't known before, that he had an appetite for this. Not for violence exactly. He didn't love the violence the way some men did, didn't seek it out for its own sake, but for the precision of it, the chess of it. The way a complex situation could be reduced to a set of problems, and each problem could be solved if you were disciplined enough and patient enough and willing to hold every emotion at arm's length for as long as the operation required. His commanding officer had told him, near the end of his service, that he had a gift for destroying things. Ethan had accepted that as a compliment, which the man had probably not entirely intended. His mother had died 14 months ago. She'd gone quickly, the doctor said, as though that was consolation. Pancreatic cancer, caught late because she'd spent a lifetime avoiding medical systems that required identification. Avoiding any system that required identification. By the time she couldn't ignore the symptoms anymore, there was nothing to be done. Ethan had been with her for the last 3 weeks, in a rented room in a city she'd moved to 8 years prior, and in those weeks she'd told him things she'd held for 38 years. Not everything. She hadn't told him everything, but enough. Enough that when she finally closed her eyes in the gray light of a Tuesday morning, Ethan sat beside her for a long time without moving, holding her hand, and when he finally let go, he already knew what he was going to do. Imashut. The Delgado meeting was at 9 in the morning in a law office on the 14th floor of a building that was aggressively unremarkable, the kind of building that existed in every mid-size American city, housing accountants and insurance adjusters and the occasional federal informant coordinator who went by the title of private consultant. Renata Delgado went by the latter. She was 51, and she had the kind of face that gave nothing away for free, broad and composed, with dark eyes that assessed rather than connected. She'd spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before moving into the private sector, and she was one of the few people outside of Ethan's immediate team who knew the full scope of what he was doing. She also, Ethan suspected, had more than a few questions about how he was doing it. "Caruso's lawyered up," she said without preamble, as he settled into the chair across from her desk. "His attorney filed a preliminary motion at 6 this morning, and they're pushing for a bail hearing before end of week. Will they get it? Probably not. The trafficking charges carry weight, and the families are cooperating, which is more than we usually get at this stage." She folded her hands on the desk. "But Caruso knows things that would be significantly more useful to us than trafficking logistics. He's been Vincent Moretti's right hand for 16 years. He has knowledge of financial structures, political contacts, evidence of conduct that goes back to when you were in grade school." She looked at Ethan steadily. "If we could get him talking before his attorney locks everything down—" "That's not my lane," Ethan said. "You know that. Your lane got 27 people out of a cargo truck last night." "I'm suggesting that your lane might be wider than you think." He looked at her. "I'm not a federal agent, Renata. I have no authority to interview witnesses, I can't offer any kind of protection agreement, and anything I obtain through direct contact with Caruso right now would complicate the prosecution rather than support it. I know what you are and what you're not." She paused. "I'm asking what you know, not what you can prove. What you know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that Caruso's operation last night wasn't a routine move," he said. "The families, the people they were transporting, they weren't the usual profile. No immigration documentation irregularities, no poverty indicators that would make them typical targets for this kind of network. These were working people. Some of them had documentation." He leaned forward slightly. "Someone was using the trafficking infrastructure to move people who were specifically being targeted, not randomly recruited. That's a different kind of operation. It means someone wanted specific people moved or disappeared, and they used Moretti's network as the mechanism." Delgado's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "You have a theory about who." "I have a direction." He stood up. "Give me 72 hours. "Ethan?" She stopped him before he reached the door. "They identified you." "Yes." "That means Vincent Moretti is paying attention to you personally, not just to the disruptions, to you." She held his gaze. "He's been running this organization for 30 years. He doesn't survive that long by being careless about threats. When he pays personal attention to something, I know." "Do you?" She didn't say it unkindly. "Because you've been operating as though this is a clinical exercise. Dismantle the infrastructure, cut the revenue streams, expose the corruption. It's been effective. But you're past the point where he'll tolerate it as background noise. You become something else now." He stood with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. "I've been something else for a while. I just haven't let him know that yet." He left before she could answer. There were things about Vincent Moretti that didn't appear in federal files or investigative reports. Things that existed only in the accumulated knowledge of people who'd been adjacent to the man for long enough. Ethan had spent months collecting those things, speaking to former associates, to people who'd been harmed by the organization and were willing to talk, to a retired city detective who'd spent 12 years building a case that ultimately went nowhere and was still angry enough about it to be useful. What emerged from all of it was a picture of a man more complex and more broken than his reputation suggested. Vincent Moretti was 71 years old. He'd built his organization from a mid-level street operation inherited from his father into one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises on the eastern seaboard over a span of 3 decades. He was intelligent, patient, and genuinely ruthless. Not in the theatrical way, but in the quiet way, the way that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in the room already knew it. He commanded loyalty through a combination of calculated generosity and the absolute certainty that betrayal would be met with consequences that went beyond the individual. He had no living family. His wife had died 12 years ago from a stroke. He had no children, officially. The retired detective, a man named Haggerty who drank too much and kept his old files and boxes in his garage, had told Ethan something over a bottle of bourbon 8 months ago that he'd never put in any official report because it had never risen above the level of bar rumor. 20 years ago, before Ethan's intelligence on the organization began, there had been a woman. Vincent's fiancée, not a public relationship, kept quiet the way a man in Vincent's position kept everything private. A woman named Naomi. Ethan had stopped breathing. She disappeared, Haggerty had said, pouring another glass. Word was Vincent had found out she was passing information to a rival family, the Marchetti crew out of Baltimore. Word was he was furious. I mean, beyond furious, some kind of cold rage those men close to him said they'd never seen before. He cut her out. Just cut her out. Said the child she was carrying wasn't his. Had people looking for her for a while, then stopped. He'd shrugged. Never saw what happened to her. Just gone. Ethan had sat there in that garage with the bourbon untouched in his hand and felt the architecture of his entire life shift 6 inches in a direction he had no name for. He hadn't told Haggerty anything. He'd thanked him, driven back to his apartment, and spent 4 hours sitting on the floor of his kitchen staring at nothing. Then he'd stood up, washed his face, and continued the operation. But things were different after that. Not the objective. The objective was the same. Dismantle the Moretti organization, expose its crimes, end its capacity to harm people the way it had harmed his mother for 20 years. But the texture of it changed. The distance he maintained between himself and the target became a different kind of distance, not clinical detachment, but something more like the effort required to handle something fragile when you are not sure of your own hands. He had not confirmed it. Not yet. There were things his mother had told him in those last 3 weeks, details she'd given him with the careful precision of someone who'd been managing the truth for a long time. But there were things she hadn't said, and things she'd been too weak at the end to say, and things he suspected she'd carried to her grave because she'd believed it was kinder. He needed to know. He wasn't ready to know. He kept dismantling the operation and moving toward the center and telling himself the knowing could wait until the work was done. He was not sure he believed that anymore. Oh, Chip. 3 days after the harbor operation, a message arrived through a channel Ethan had established for anonymous tips from people inside the Moretti organization, a dead drop system, encrypted, routed through enough intermediaries to be essentially untraceable. He'd gotten maybe a dozen useful tips through it over 11 months, usually from low-level employees who were frightened or who had a grievance against management, the kind of thing that didn't need to be dramatically heroic to be useful. This one was different. The message was short, 2 sentences, a location and a date 3 days out. And then, he wants to meet you. He says you already know why. No name, no identification. But the locational detail in the message was specific enough that it could only have come from someone inside the organization's inner circle. And the phrasing, he says you already know why, turned over and over in Ethan's head like a stone in a current. He showed it to Marcus. Marcus read it twice and set the phone down on the table between them with the deliberate care of a man handling something he doesn't entirely trust. This is a setup. Maybe. It's a classic isolation tactic. Offer a meeting, establish the location, control the terrain. Or it's what it says it is. Ethan picked the phone up and read it again. He knows my name. He knows what I've been doing. The Moretti organization doesn't request meetings. They don't negotiate. They don't parlay. That's not how they operate. Vincent Moretti has not sat across a table from an adversary in 20 years. He set the phone down again. If he's asking for a meeting, it's because something has changed. Or because he wants you in a room he controls. That too. Possibly both. Ethan looked at his hands on the table. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the trick of it. I'm going to respond. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Of course you are. I'm going to set conditions. Location of my choosing, perimeter established by our people, no weapons on either side. If he's serious about a meeting, he'll accept the conditions. If he's not, you'll have tipped our entire hand trying to establish the logistics. Our hand is already tipped, Marcus. Caruso said my name in front of witnesses. Ethan pushed back from the table and stood up. The anonymous phase of this operation is over. Whatever comes next, it comes in the open. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. There's something you're not telling me. Ethan met his gaze. There are a lot of things I'm not telling you. That's been true since the beginning. I know, but this... Marcus gestured at the phone, at something larger than the phone. This feels different. Ethan picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Set up a meeting protocol. I want 4 positions established at any location we agree to, and I want eyes on the Moretti compound from this point forward. Anything moves out of there, vehicles, personnel, anything. I want to know about it in real time. And if he sends back an acceptance, then we have a meeting. He paused at the door, and I find out how much he actually knows. Vincent Moretti received the news of the harbor operation from his head of security on a Thursday evening, standing in the study of his home, while outside the windows the city spread its lights across the dark, in patterns that, from this elevation, almost looked like something organized. He listened to the report without interruption. The seizure of the convoy, the liberation of the families, Caruso's arrest, the federal handoff, and when it was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Carter, he said. Yes, sir. He was physically present at the operation. Our people believe so. The tactical signature matches everything else we've attributed to his team over the past 11 months. A pause. He's military trained, special operations background probably, though we haven't confirmed the specific unit. He works with a small team, never more than 8 or 10 people, extremely disciplined. I know what his team looks like. Vincent walked to the window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out. I've been watching his work for 6 months, since before anyone else in the organization put it together. He was quiet again. What I want to know is what he looks like. A photograph appeared on his desk, printed from surveillance footage, grainy but functional. He picked it up. His security chief watched him carefully, the way a man watches someone standing at the edge of something without being sure whether to step closer or back away. Vincent Moretti stood at the window holding the photograph for 45 seconds. His face changed during those 45 seconds in ways that were subtle, but to anyone who knew him well, profound. Something moved through the jaw. Something shifted behind the eyes. Not weakness, nothing that could be called weakness, but a fundamental alteration in the quality of his attention. Get me a DNA analyst, he said, someone who works outside of official channels. His security chief blinked. Sir? You heard me? He set the photograph down on his desk, face up. The grainy image looked back at both of them. And contact Sal's attorney. Tell them I'll cover whatever defense they need, but I want Sal kept quiet about the Carter matter specifically. He turned from the window. Don't ask me questions right now. Yes, sir. And find out everything about his mother, everything. The security chief left without further questions, which was one of the reasons he'd lasted as long as he had. Vincent Moretti stood alone in his study looking at the photograph, and somewhere beneath the iron composure of a man who had run an empire on the principle that emotion was a liability, something moved that had not moved in 20 years. He hadn't searched for her. He'd told himself that was strength, that walking away and not looking back was the decision of a man who understood that sentimentality was a weapon people used against you. He'd built a prison of that conviction and lived in it for 2 decades, and occasionally, in moments he never acknowledged to anyone, he had stood in exactly this kind of quiet and felt the weight of it. He had not known about the child. He'd said the words, "That child is no son of mine," not because he'd known it for certain, but because the rage had demanded words that cut, and those words had cut in every direction at once, including through himself, though he'd been too proud to feel it at the time. He picked up the photograph again. The resemblance was there in the photograph the same way it was there in the mirror. Not exact, not the kind of thing that would announce itself to a stranger, but the kind that lived in structure, in the set of the jaw, in the way the eyes focused, if it was what he thought it was, If the thing Caruso had hinted at before his arrest, the thing Caruso had clearly not understood the full weight of, was true. He had an operation running against his organization for 11 months, and the man running it might be... He set the photograph down. He needed to be sure. And then he needed to decide what a man did with that kind of certainty. The encrypted response came back within 24 hours of Ethan's conditional acceptance. 3 words and a counterproposal on location. The counterproposal was for a neutral site, not the location in the original message, not any Moretti-controlled property, but a third location that Ethan's team spent 6 hours vetting and found to be genuinely unaffiliated. A warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city that had changed hands 3 times in the past decade and currently sat empty, pending rezoning. No surveillance infrastructure, no obvious tactical advantage made for either side. The 3 words were, "Bring nothing hidden." Ethan read them and felt something in his chest that he didn't examine. He called Marcus. "It's real," he said. Marcus was quiet for 2 seconds. "How do you know?" "Because a man running a trap doesn't tell you not to bring anything hidden. A man running a trap wants you comfortable. A man running a trap says whatever makes you feel like the situation is under control." He looked at the response on his phone screen. This is someone who wants to say something and is trying, in the only language he knows, to signal that. Or it's exactly the kind of thing a very experienced trap setter says to make you think that. Yes. Ethan pocketed the phone. Both things can be true. The meeting was in 36 hours. Ethan spent those hours doing what he'd learned to do in every situation that had the potential to go wrong in irreversible ways. He worked backward from the worst possible outcome and built his contingencies from the inside out. He set his people. He established communication protocols, extraction routes, abort conditions. He did everything a professional did to protect himself and his team. And then, alone in his apartment in the hour before he needed to leave, he sat at the table where his mother had laid out the truth for him in pieces, in that rented room, in those last terrible weeks, and he let himself think about what it would mean. What it would actually mean to sit across a table from the man who had thrown his mother into the cold, who had said the words that condemned them both to 2 decades of hiding, who had built an empire on other people's pain while Naomi Carter worked cash jobs in borrowed cities and raised her son on the only love she had left. His hands were on the table. He looked at them. They were still steady. He picked up his jacket and went to the door, and it wasn't until his hand was on the knob that he noticed, for the first time in 11 months of this operation, that they were not quite steady after all. Not much, just enough to notice. He closed his hand into a fist, opened it again, and walked out. The warehouse was dark when Ethan arrived, and dark when his team finished their sweep, and dark when, 20 minutes later, a single vehicle pulled through the loading bay entrance and stopped. 1 vehicle. 2 men got out, a driver who stayed by the car and a man who walked forward into the cone of light from the one portable lamp Ethan's people had set up in the center of the empty space. Vincent Moretti was taller than Ethan had expected, or the photographs hadn't captured it. He walked with the slight stiffness of a man in his early 70s, whose joints had begun registering their objections, but the posture was straight and the movement was unhurried. The walk of a man who had decided before he left home how this would go and was now simply executing it. He stopped 10 feet from Ethan and looked at him in the lamplight. Up close, in person, the thing that Ethan had seen in the photograph and told himself could be attributed to poor image quality was not attributable to poor image quality. He felt it land somewhere in his sternum like something physical, and he held very still. Vincent Moretti looked at him with the eyes of a man who had already reached a conclusion and was now simply confirming it. His face was lined, the hair gone gray, the hands that hung at his sides showing their age, but the eyes were clear, and they held something that Ethan hadn't expected. Not calculation, not threat. Something that had no clean name in the language of men like them. "I know what you've been doing," Vincent said. His voice was lower than Ethan had anticipated. 11 months. The supply chain disruptions, the financial intercepts, the port operations. All of it. He paused. "It's good work." Ethan said nothing. "Your mother taught you to be careful," Vincent said. "To move without leaving traces. Another pause. Longer. I didn't know she was teaching our son. The words sat in the cold air of the warehouse between them like something alive. Ethan felt his heartbeat against his ribs, steady and hard, and he kept his face as still as he knew how to keep it, which was very still, which was not still enough for this. Don't, he said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that. I'm not here to claim anything, Vincent said. I lost that right a long time ago. I know that. He held Ethan's gaze without flinching. I'm here because you've been taking apart everything I built, and you deserve to know that you're not wrong to do it. And because... He stopped. Something moved across his face, controlled and brief. Because I need to show you something. Something that changes what we're both looking for. He reached into his coat with 2 fingers, slowly, demonstrably careful, and produced a single folded document. He held it out. Ethan looked at the document in Vincent's extended hand for a long moment without taking it. The warehouse was silent around them. Somewhere in the dark at the perimeter, he knew his people were watching. He knew Marcus had his eyes on this from the eastern access point. He knew all the exits and all the contingencies. None of that was what he was thinking about. He reached out and took the document. He unfolded it. And the world he'd spent 11 months building, the clean architecture of purpose and direction and righteous damage, shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the operation at all, and everything to do with the single name written at the top of the page in a handwriting he recognized. His mother's handwriting. Ethan read the document twice standing in the lamplight, and the second time through he was aware of his own breathing in a way he almost never was. Aware of it the way you become aware of your heartbeat when something tilts the ground under you, and the automatic systems of your body decide, without consulting you, that this moment requires monitoring. It was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, the paper worn at the folds the way paper gets when it's been opened and closed many times over many years. His mother's handwriting. He'd have known it anywhere. The particular slant of her lowercase letters, the way she formed her sevens, but a version of her handwriting that was younger than any he'd seen. The ink had faded to brown at the edges. This letter had existed for a long time before he had known about it. He read it without expression. He was good at that. When he finished, he refolded it along its original creases and held it in his hand and looked at Vincent Moretti. "Where did you get this?" he said. It wasn't a question. "A man named Reeves brought it to me 6 days ago. He was one of my couriers. 20 years ago, low-level, handled document transfers between operations." Vincent's voice was measured, each word placed with care. "He's dying. Liver cancer. He came to me with that letter and 3 others because he said he'd been carrying them for 2 decades, and he didn't want to die with them." A pause. "He'd been paid to intercept correspondence. Your mother's correspondence. Letters she'd written to me in those last weeks before she disappeared." "She wrote to you?" "Apparently, more than once." Vincent's jaw moved. "I never received them." Ethan looked at the letter in his hand. The letter described, in his mother's precise and careful prose, a meeting she'd been forced to attend, forced, the word underlined once, with a man she identified only by a single initial. A meeting at which she'd been presented with a choice: provide information about Vincent's operation or watch the people she cared about be systematically destroyed. The letter described her refusal. It described the fabrication she'd known was being constructed around her. It described her attempt to reach Vincent before the lie could be delivered. It described the letter never arriving. Ethan folded the paper one more time and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He felt Vincent watching this action, and he didn't look up until he was done. "The initial," Ethan said. "In the letter, she only used an initial." "I know who it is," Vincent said. The warehouse was very quiet. "Tell me," Ethan said. Vincent looked at him for a moment, not hesitating but measuring, the look of a man deciding not what to say but how much, and in what order. It was a look Ethan recognized because he'd worn it himself countless times, and recognizing it in this face, in these circumstances, sent a current through him that he had no interest in naming. "His name is Frank Dolan," Vincent said. "He's been my deputy director of internal operations for 22 years. He's the man I trusted more than any other person in my organization." A beat. "He's the man who told me your mother was working for the Marchetti family." Ethan was still for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away from the lamplight toward the eastern wall, needing 6 feet of distance and the cold dark to process what his face was doing. He stood there with his back to Vincent and his hand flat against the concrete wall, rough and cold under his palm, and he breathed. Frank Dolan. He knew the name. It was in his files. It was near the center of the financial architecture he'd been mapping for 11 months. Not the center, but close to it, connected to enough of the money flows that Ethan had flagged him as significant, but hadn't yet elevated him to primary target. Because the primary target had always been Vincent. Because the organization's power derived from Vincent. Because he'd been looking at this from the wrong angle for 11 months. He turned back. "You're sure," he said. "I've been sure for 4 days." Vincent's voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but less armored. "I spent those 4 days hoping I was wrong." "What does Dolan know about this meeting?" "Nothing yet. I gave no indication to anyone in my organization that I'd spoken to Reeves or received the letters." Vincent paused. "But Dolan is not a stupid man. He's been watching me for 22 years the same way I thought I was watching him. If I behave differently, he'll know something has changed." Ethan came back into the lamplight. He looked at the older man across the small, bright circle and felt the strangeness of this. The absolute disorienting strangeness of standing in a warehouse in the middle of the night with this particular human being having this particular conversation. Press against the inside of his chest like something trying to get out, and he kept it in. "You came to me," he said, "not to your own people, not to any of the law enforcement relationships a man in your position maintains. You came to me." "Yes." "Why?" Vincent looked at him without blinking. "Because you've spent 11 months dismantling my organization with more precision than any federal investigation in 30 years. Because you clearly have both the skills and the motivation to see this through. And because—" He stopped. The jaw again, that controlled movement. "Because if what I believe is true, then you have more right to be in that room when this ends than anyone else." Ethan held his gaze for a long time. "I need to verify the letters independently," he said. "I'm not taking your word for anything. Not yet." "I expected that. And I need everything you have on Dolan. Financial records, operational history, communications, everything. You'll have it. And if any of this is a setup—" Ethan let the sentence end without finishing it, which was its own kind of statement. "I know," Vincent said quietly. "I know." Hold. Marcus said nothing for a long time after Ethan finished. They were in the van again, parked 3 miles from the warehouse, the city moving past the tinted windows in its nighttime patterns, while Marcus sat across from Ethan with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had just been handed a situation that violated every operational principle he'd spent his professional life building. "So?" Marcus said finally. "So. Vincent Moretti just handed you evidence that one of his own senior people fabricated the reason your mother was exiled, and he's offering to cooperate to take Dolan down. That's what happened, yes, and you believe him." Ethan looked at his hands. "I believe the letters. The handwriting is my mother's. The content is consistent with things she told me in the last weeks of her life. The paper and ink will need to be analyzed, but I don't think that comes back as fabrication." He paused. "Whether I believe Vincent is a separate question, which you haven't answered." "No." Marcus unfolded his arms and ran a hand over his face. He was tired. They were all tired. The kind of tired that had become a baseline so long ago that distinguishing it from alertness was an academic exercise. "Walk me through the exposure if this is a trap. What does he gain?" "He identifies me. He gets me in a controlled location." Ethan shook his head slightly. "But he didn't control the location. I did. My people had that space for 6 hours before he arrived, and he came with one man. If you wanted to neutralize a threat, that's not how you do it. Unless the threat neutralization happens in a second phase, you leave the meeting reassured, you lower your guard. I haven't lowered my guard. You're considering working with the man you've spent 11 months trying to destroy. I'm considering whether the man I've spent 11 months trying to destroy was working with incomplete information for 20 of the past 22 years. Ethan looked out the window. Which means my operational picture has been incomplete too. Marcus was quiet again. Then, what do you need from me? Get Diaz to run a forensic analysis on the letters. Paper dating, ink composition, everything she can do without a lab affiliation that creates a paper trail. I want independent confirmation that those documents are what they appear to be. He paused. And I need everything we have on Frank Dolan pulled and re-examined. Every financial connection, every operational decision we've attributed to the organization. I want to look at it again with Dolan as a potential principal rather than a subordinate. Marcus reached for his tablet. That's going to take at least 48 hours. Then we have 48 hours. The 48 hours were not quiet. On the first morning, Ethan received confirmation through his Port Authority contact that Sal Caruso had, in the hours before his attorney had fully locked down his communications, made a single phone call from custody. Not to the Moretti organization's legal team, not to Vincent. The call had lasted 40 seconds and had gone to a number that, when Ethan's team ran it back through 3 layers of proxy registration, resolved to a holding company connected to a man named Francis James Dolan. He sat with that for an hour before he moved again. On the first afternoon, Diaz called, not over an encrypted line, which meant she'd found something significant enough that she wanted to hear his voice. The paper is consistent with production methods used 20 years ago. Not recently manufactured to look old. Actually, old. Her voice was careful, scientific. The voice she used when she wanted to be precise. The ink is iron gall, which was a common handwriting ink of that period and is almost impossible to replicate convincingly in a short time frame without specialist equipment. And there are what appear to be water stains on 2 of the pages, environmental staining, over time. So they're real. I can't say definitively without a full lab workup, but if someone faked these documents, they were extraordinarily patient about it. A pause. Ethan, whose handwriting is it? He didn't answer for a moment. Someone I trusted. She understood, the way Diaz always understood, that this was the end of the conversation on that point. I'll write up what I have and send it through the secure channel. Thank you. He ended the call and sat in the stillness of his apartment and thought about his mother writing letters she believed would reach the man who'd told her the child she was carrying was no son of his, and he felt something move through him that was not grief exactly. Grief had a shape he knew, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the space between grief and fury and hadn't decided yet which way to fall. He put it somewhere internal and closed the door on it. On the second morning, Marcus arrived at the apartment with his tablet and dark circles under his eyes, and the specific posture of a man who has been awake too long, finding things he didn't want to find. Dolan, he said, setting the tablet on the kitchen table and pulling up the reconstructed file. Here's what we missed. What they'd missed, in 11 months of careful work, was that Frank Dolan's financial footprint inside the Moretti organization was significantly larger than his official role suggested. Not in ways that were obvious, but it was good work, elegant even, the kind of financial architecture that required patience and intelligence to build, embedded so deeply inside the legitimate money flows that Ethan's team had repeatedly looked at it and seen Moretti infrastructure where they should have seen Dolan infrastructure. He's been siphoning, Marcus said. Not stealing, not exactly. More like building a parallel economy inside the organization. Supplier relationships that appear to run through the syndicate, but actually run through Dolan-connected holding companies. Revenue from specific operations, trafficking, primarily, and some arms brokerage. That the records show going to Moretti accounts, but the actual transfers show going through an extra layer. He scrolled through the data. He's been doing it for at least 15 years, probably longer. He used Vincent's organization to build his own, Ethan said, a shadow empire. Still dependent on Moretti's infrastructure and reputation, but increasingly his own operation. And if Moretti ever fell, Marcus looked up. Dolan would have the resources and the connections to step directly into the vacuum. He wouldn't need to take over. He'd already be there. Ethan stood at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand. The city was gray and wet outside, a morning that hadn't decided to commit to rain, but hadn't decided against it either. He needed Moretti weakened but not destroyed, Ethan said. A Vincent in decline is more useful to him than a Vincent who's gone, because a Vincent who's gone creates open warfare, and open warfare is bad for business. But a Vincent who's isolated, who's made terrible decisions, who's lost key relationships, and whose organization is contracting. He turned from the window. That's a man Dolan can manage. That's a man who needs Dolan more than Dolan needs him. And eliminating Naomi, Marcus said carefully, 20 years ago. If we're reading this right, Naomi was close to Vincent. She had his trust, which meant she was positioned to see things Dolan didn't want seen. Ethan set the coffee down on the counter. And she was pregnant, which meant a child, an heir, a future complication. He stopped. Dolan didn't just want her gone. He wanted every connection she represented severed. The kitchen was quiet. Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who has pieced together a picture and is not entirely sure he should have. Ethan, don't, Ethan said. I'm not going to pretend I haven't worked it out. Then work it out quietly and keep it professional. Ethan picked up the tablet and closed the files. We have work to do. He met Vincent again that afternoon in a different location, a parking structure on the edge of the commercial district, 3rd level, largely empty on a Wednesday afternoon. Ethan arrived first and stood by the concrete railing looking out at the city while he waited, and when Vincent's footsteps came across the oil-stained floor behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He let the footsteps stop, and he looked out at the city for another 3 seconds, which was all he allowed himself, and then he turned. Vincent looked like a man who hadn't slept. Ethan recognized this because he looked the same way and was looking at it from the outside for the first time. Your man Caruso called Dolan from custody, Ethan said. No preamble. Something crossed Vincent's face, quick, controlled, gone. I didn't know that. 40 seconds before his attorney had a full hold on his communications. Ethan watched the older man. That means Dolan knows Caruso was picked up. He doesn't know what Caruso said, if anything, but he knows the operation failed and he knows the Carter name is in play. He'll be moving to protect himself. He'll be moving to do more than that. Ethan came away from the railing. A man who spent 22 years building a shadow infrastructure inside your organization doesn't protect himself by going quiet. He protects himself by accelerating. If he suspects you're starting to look at him, he'll move before I can. Vincent's voice was flat. Yes, I know how he thinks. Then we don't have 48 hours. We probably don't have 24. Ethan stopped 2 feet from the older man. Up close, in daylight, the resemblance was something he had to consciously stop himself from examining. I need access to your internal communications. Direct access, not summaries. And I need a list of every asset Dolan has operational authority over. Every safe house, every financial account he has signing authority on, every personnel relationship that runs through him specifically. Vincent looked at him steadily. That's the architecture of my entire operation. Yes. You understand what you're asking me to hand you. I understand that if Dolan moves first and we don't have that information, he burns what he wants to burn and disappears with what he's built, and you have nothing left, and neither do I. Ethan held his gaze. I also understand that if you give me that information, and this is some kind of maneuver, you've destroyed yourself in a way that can't be undone. So we're both walking into the same exposure. That's as close to trust as I can offer you right now. A long silence. A truck moved on the street below, and its sound echoed through the parking structure's open sides and faded. There's something else, Vincent said. Ethan waited. Among the materials Reeves brought me, the intercepted letters, there was one that wasn't from your mother. Vincent reached into his coat and produced a smaller document, a single page, unfolded. It was from Reeves himself, a record he kept, of his instructions. He held it out. Who paid him? What he was told to do with the letters he intercepted. Ethan took it, read it. Dolan's name was not on the page, but a transaction number was, and a date, and an account reference that Ethan's team had spent 6 weeks chasing through the financial architecture of the organization before losing it in a layered holding structure. He looked up. You already ran this, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. My financial people ran it before I knew I couldn't trust the conclusions they'd give me. Vincent's voice was very controlled. I ran it again myself, manually, last night, cross-referenced against the internal ledgers I keep separately, that no one else has access to. A pause. That account originated with a transfer from Dolan's personal operational fund. 20 years ago. 6 weeks before your mother disappeared. Ethan folded the page carefully and put it in his pocket alongside the letter. He felt the architecture of the next move assembling in his head. Not just the tactical structure, but something beneath it. Something that involved the specific weight of 2 pieces of paper in his inside jacket pocket. And the man standing across from him who had said our son in a warehouse the night before and had not taken it back. I need your communications access and the asset list by tonight, he said. And I need you to behave exactly as you normally would toward Dolan for the next 12 hours. No change in pattern, no tells. And after 12 hours? Ethan looked at him. After 12 hours, we find out if Frank Dolan is as smart as he thinks he is. He turned to leave. Carter. He stopped, but didn't turn fully. Half profile in the concrete-filtered daylight. I know I don't have the right to say anything to you about... Vincent stopped. Started again. I know what I did, what I said. I'm not asking you to... Another stop. The words seemed to cost him something genuine, which was not what Ethan had expected. I just need you to know that I know. Ethan stood still for a moment. Do your part tonight, he said. Behave normally. Don't signal anything. He paused. The rest of it can wait until after. He walked away across the parking structure, his footsteps steady on the concrete, and he did not let himself think about what the rest of it actually meant. Because if he started thinking about that, he would stop moving, and he could not afford to stop moving right now. Not when Dolan was already shifting, and the clock had contracted to hours, and the 2 documents in his jacket pocket were evidence of a lie that had shaped every single day of his life. He kept walking. Behind him, he heard nothing from Vincent Moretti, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing the man had communicated yet. At 6 that evening, Marcus took a call he hadn't been expecting. He was at the secondary operations space, a rented suite above a print shop in the North Quarter, their main working location for the past 4 months, when his secondary phone rang. The number was one he recognized after a half second, and recognizing it sent a cold thing moving through his chest that he kept entirely out of his voice when he answered. This is unexpected, he said. The voice on the other end was precise and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the most powerful person was also the calmest person and had learned to inhabit that position so thoroughly it was indistinguishable from his natural register. Mr. Webb, Frank Dolan said, I think it's time we had a conversation without your employer present. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone by a fraction. I don't have an employer. Of course you don't. Forgive the imprecision. A brief pause. I know what Ethan Carter is. I know what he's been doing and why, and I know that you're a professional man who has been operating in a situation that is considerably more complicated than you were probably led to believe when you signed on. Another pause, calculated. I'd like to offer you some information, in exchange for a conversation. Marcus kept his breathing even and his voice flat, and he looked at the wall across the room while his mind moved very fast through what this call meant, and what it didn't mean, and what Ethan would need to know, and how quickly. What kind of information, he said. The kind, Dolan said, that explains why Ethan Carter is about to make a mistake that cannot be corrected. The room was very quiet. Marcus said nothing. He trusts Vincent now, Dolan said. I expected that. Vincent can be compelling when he needs to be. And the letters? Yes, I know about the letters. I've known about Reeves for longer than Vincent has. The letters are real. I won't insult your intelligence by suggesting otherwise. But there are things in those letters Vincent hasn't told Ethan. Things Naomi wrote that Vincent has chosen not to share. A pause. Because they change the picture in ways that are inconvenient for Vincent. The phone felt heavier in Marcus's hand than it had 30 seconds ago. What things? Marcus said. Meet me, Dolan said. 2 hours. I'll send you a location. The call ended. Marcus sat very still in the rented suite above the print shop and looked at the wall and made himself think clearly for 30 seconds, which was when the suite's door opened. He looked up. The two men who came through the door were not people he knew, but the way they moved told him everything about who had sent them. And Marcus Webb understood in the space of a single breath that Dolan had not actually expected him to show up to any meeting, and that the phone call had been something else entirely. A distraction, a few seconds of occupied attention, enough time for two men to cross a street and climb a flight of stairs. He dropped the phone and moved. He was fast. He'd always been fast. But the room was small, and there were two of them, and one had already crossed half the distance before Marcus had fully cleared his chair. And when the collision came, it drove him back into the desk with enough force to scatter everything on its surface and send a white-hot signal up through his left shoulder that told him something had gone wrong in the joint. He got one of them down. He was good enough for that. But the second man was better than the first, and in the close quarters of a suite above a print shop with a shoulder that wasn't working right and a phone that was somewhere on the floor, Marcus Webb ran out of good options very quickly. The last thing he managed, before the situation became unrecoverable, was to knock the encrypted phone under the far edge of the desk with his foot. Not hidden, not perfectly, but angled in a way that might buy it from casual discovery. Then things went dark. And Ethan Carter, 3 miles away, looked at his phone and waited for a check-in that did not come, and felt something cold move through him that was not quite fear, but was the closest thing to it he'd experienced in a very long time. Ethan called Marcus at 7:14 and got nothing. He called again at 7:17, then at 7:21. 3 calls, 3 silences, and on the third silence he was already moving, jacket on, keys in hand, out the apartment door before the call had fully disconnected, because Marcus Webb did not miss check-ins. In 11 months of operating together across situations that had included federal surveillance, armed confrontations, and at least 2 occasions where the exit route had collapsed mid-operation, Marcus had never missed a check-in. It was the one thing Ethan had never had to think about. Marcus checked in. He drove fast and didn't use the radio and kept his hands loose on the wheel, because tight hands on a wheel were a sign of panic, and panic used oxygen the brain needed for other things. He ran the timeline as he drove, the last confirmed contact 42 minutes ago, a brief update that the Dolan financial reconstruction was 60% complete. Nothing alarming in Marcus's voice. Nothing that suggested the situation had changed, which meant the change had been fast. He parked 2 blocks from the print shop and went the rest of the way on foot, staying on the opposite side of the street, scanning the building's exterior from across the width of the road. The lights in the upper suite were on. The print shop below was dark and closed. The street was ordinary. A couple walking a dog, a delivery vehicle double-parked half a block north. The usual evening texture of a commercial neighborhood transitioning to residential quiet. Nothing overtly wrong, which was its own kind of signal. He went around the back, through the alley, and came up the rear stairs with his back to the wall and his hand not on a weapon because he hadn't brought one, a decision he now reassessed as he climbed, though the reassessment changed nothing. He reached the rear door of the suite and found it unlocked, which meant either Marcus had left in a hurry or someone else had come through this way, and both possibilities tightened something in his chest. He went in low and fast and swept the room in 3 seconds. Marcus was on the floor beside the overturned desk, conscious, one hand pressed to the side of his head, and the other arm held at an angle that indicated the shoulder was damaged. He looked up when Ethan came in, and the expression on his face was something Ethan had never seen there before. Not quite fear, but the particular look of a man who has had a few minutes to sit with a bad situation and has arrived at a clear-eyed assessment of how bad it actually is. "I got one of them down," Marcus said. His voice was steady but effortful. "How many?" "2. They came through the front while I was on the phone." He paused. "Dolan called me." Ethan crouched beside him and ran a quick check. Head injury was superficial, bleeding minimal. The shoulder was dislocated rather than broken, which was painful but manageable. He'd dealt with dislocated shoulders before. He put his hand on Marcus's upper arm. "This is going to be unpleasant." "It already is." "On 3. He didn't count to 3, but that was the trick, the one a medic had taught him years ago. He reset the joint on 2, and Marcus made a sound through his teeth that was as close to a scream as a man of his particular composure was capable of producing. And then it was done, and Marcus sat against the wall breathing hard while the worst of it passed. "The phone," Marcus said, "under the far edge of the desk." Ethan found it, undamaged. He handed it back and stood up and looked at the room, the scattered papers, the overturned chair, the specific geography of a fight that had gone badly in a small space, and he processed it. "What did Dolan say?" Ethan said. "That Vincent hasn't shown me everything in the letters." Marcus tested his shoulder carefully, wincing. "He said Naomi wrote things that Vincent chose not to share, things that changed the picture." He looked up at Ethan. "Then he sent 2 men while I was still on the line. The call was a distraction." "Or both," Ethan said. "The information and the distraction, neither one cancels the other." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You think there's something in the letters Vincent held back?" "I think a man who spent 22 years being managed by Frank Dolan is capable of managing information himself." Ethan picked up his own phone. "I think we assumed Vincent's cooperation meant full disclosure. Those aren't the same thing." He was already moving toward the door. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we need to move. If Dolan sent people here, he knows this location. We've lost it." He paused at the door. "And I need to talk to Vincent. Tonight. Right now." Itet. He didn't call ahead. He drove to the Moretti residence, a house in a neighborhood of large old homes set back from the street behind mature trees, the kind of neighborhood that had money without announcing it. And he parked at the curb and walked to the front door and knocked. The man who answered was not Vincent. He was security, broad and alert, and he looked at Ethan with the flat professional assessment of someone doing the math on threat level and response. "Tell him Carter is here," Ethan said. "Tell him it's not a request." He waited on the step for 90 seconds. Then the security man came back and stepped aside, and Ethan walked into Vincent Moretti's house for the first time and followed a hallway that smelled of old wood and something cooking earlier in the evening, and arrived at the study. Vincent was standing by the desk. He was still dressed from earlier, the same dark jacket, no tie. And his face when Ethan came through the door showed the particular alertness of a man who'd been waiting for something and wasn't certain what shape it was going to arrive in. Ethan closed the door behind him. "Dolan's people hit our operations space tonight," he said. "My second-in-command is injured. We've lost the location." He crossed the room and stopped 4 feet from Vincent. And Dolan told him, before he sent the men, that there are things in those letters you haven't shown me. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds, Ethan watched Vincent Moretti's face with the complete unblinking attention of someone reading a document for evidence of forgery, and what he saw was not the blankness of a man with nothing to hide. What he saw was something more complicated, the face of a man making a decision he'd been postponing. "Sit down," Vincent said. "No." Vincent looked at him. Then he moved to the desk and opened the lower right drawer and took out an envelope. He held it for a moment, not dramatically, not performing anything, just holding it with the weight of a man who has been carrying something and is putting it down. He held it out. Ethan took it. The envelope had been opened. Inside was a single folded page. Same paper, same handwriting as the letters he'd already read, same faded ink. He read it. The room was very quiet while he read it, and it stayed quiet after he finished, and Ethan stood with the page in his hand and felt the specific sensation of a structure he'd built with precision and care. Not just this operation, but the narrative that had sustained him through 11 months of it, the clean story of what had happened and why and what it demanded of him, come apart at one of its foundational points. His mother had written this letter last, after the others, after the attempts to reach Vincent had failed and after she'd understood that the lie had already been delivered and accepted. She'd written it knowing it probably wouldn't reach him either, and she'd written it anyway because Naomi Carter had been, at her core, a woman who believed in the record, in the importance of the truth existing somewhere, even if no one was reading it. In the letter, she described what she had not included in the others, not an omission born of deception. He understood that, reading her words, her precise and careful words, but an omission born of the belief that some things were too dangerous to write down while she was still trying to get out. She had, in the weeks before the lie was delivered to Vincent, discovered something about Dolan, something specific, a transaction, a name, a record of a meeting between Dolan and a senior figure in the Marchetti family. Not her meeting Marchetti people. Dolan's meeting. She'd found it accidentally through a document she'd been asked to file by Vincent's administrative staff, and she'd understood immediately what it meant and had gone to the one person in the organization she'd trusted besides Vincent, the one person she'd trusted. She'd gone to Sal Caruso. Ethan read the name and reread it, and the cold thing that moved through him was not surprise exactly, but the particular sensation of a piece you've been holding landing in a space you didn't know was waiting for it. She'd gone to Caruso. Caruso had listened. Caruso had told her to give him 48 hours to verify what she'd found before they brought it to Vincent together. 48 hours during which Naomi had received no word from Caruso, and at the end of which the lie had already reached Vincent and the order had already come down, and she had understood finally what 48 hours had actually been for. Ethan folded the page. He was precise about it, the same way he'd been precise about the first letters, and his hands did not shake. He was very focused on his hands. "Caruso," he said. "Yes," Vincent said. "Caruso has been working with Dolan." "For how long?" "I don't know. Long enough." Vincent's voice was careful. "I discovered it when I cross-referenced the account information in Reeves's document against internal records Caruso manages. There are irregularities that only make sense if Caruso was a secondary layer in Dolan's financial structure." A pause. "I didn't tell you because I needed to confirm it before I put Caruso in federal custody," Ethan said, "which I did 9 days ago." Another silence. "Yes," Vincent said. Ethan set the letter on the desk between them. He took 2 steps back and stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the wall past Vincent's shoulder and made himself breathe evenly for 5 seconds. "Caruso is in federal holding, and Dolan just called my second-in-command and sent 2 men to our operations location," he said, "which means one of 2 things. Either Caruso found a way to communicate with Dolan from custody and told him enough to trigger a response, or Dolan had independent surveillance on my operation that I haven't identified." He brought his gaze back to Vincent. "Either way, Dolan knows the timeline has changed. He knows I'm in contact with you, and he knows we're moving toward him. Which means he'll move first. He's already moving." Ethan picked up his phone and called Chen. When Chen answered, he spoke for 30 seconds, gave 3 instructions, and ended the call. Then he called Reyes and repeated a version of the same. Then he stood in Vincent Moretti's study and looked at the older man and said the thing he'd been building toward since he walked through the door. "I need to know everything. Not the version you've been releasing to me incrementally, everything. What Dolan controls, what he knows about you that you haven't told me, what leverage he has, what you're afraid of, all of it, right now." Vincent held his gaze for a moment. Then he moved to the chair behind the desk and sat down, and the act of sitting seemed to cost him something. Not weakness, but the specific weight of a man settling into an accounting he's owed for a long time. "Sit down," he said again. This time, Ethan sat and checked. It took an hour. Vincent Moretti was not, by nature, a man who unburdened himself. Ethan understood this within the first 10 minutes. Watching the way the words came out, deliberate and measured, each piece of information handled before it was released like a man sorting through things he's kept in the dark, for so long that bringing them into light requires a moment of adjustment for each one. But he talked. He talked with the particular honesty of someone who has run out of the option of anything else, and Ethan listened without interruption, taking nothing down, keeping everything in the organized architecture of his own memory where it wouldn't be lost. Dolan's leverage was specific and serious. Over 22 years, he had accumulated documentation of Vincent's conduct that went beyond what any federal investigation had managed to compile. Not because he'd worked harder than the investigators, but because he'd been inside, present for conversations and transactions that left no external trace, and had been quietly, patiently recording. Not for immediate use, for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when the balance shifted and the documentation became the difference between Dolan walking away free and Dolan going down with everything else. "He told me," Vincent said. "Not recently. 6 years ago, when I tried to restructure the operations in a way that would have reduced his authority. He told me clearly that he had material sufficient to end me, and that he had no desire to use it as long as our arrangement continued to function. He looked at his hands on the desk. I told myself it was a manageable situation. You were being blackmailed by your own deputy for 6 years. I was choosing not to call it that. Ethan looked at him. The families and the trafficking operation, the people in Caruso's trucks, you knew. A pause. I knew the operation existed. I didn't know the specifics of who was being moved or why. Vincent met his gaze. I'm not asking you to distinguish that. Good. Ethan stood up. Because I'm not going to. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark street and the lit windows of the houses across it, and thought about the shape of what he now had. Not the clean picture he'd constructed over 11 months, but a messier and more accurate one, full of people who had failed each other in compounding ways over 2 decades. A structure of betrayal that had Dolan at its center, but implicated others in its maintenance. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. Mr. Carter. Frank Dolan's voice was exactly as Marcus had described it. Precise, unhurried, comfortable. I was hoping we could speak directly. I think it would save time. Ethan kept his voice flat. You sent men to hurt my people. I sent men to deliver a message. The message being that this situation has escalated beyond what a private operation can manage. A brief pause. I'd like to propose a different arrangement. You don't have anything I want. I have Marcus Webb. A beat of silence, carefully placed. He's with me now. He's unharmed, and he'll stay that way as long as our conversation remains productive. Ethan's jaw tightened by a fraction, and he controlled it. He looked at his phone, the encrypted line to Marcus, which he'd last used 30 minutes ago to confirm Marcus was mobile and relocating. 30 minutes. Somewhere between then and now. Put him on, Ethan said. A shuffle. Then Marcus's voice, tight but controlled. I walked into it. Street level between the van and the secondary location. 3 men. A pause. I'm all right. Then Dolan again. You see, cooperative arrangement for now. His voice didn't change register. It was the voice of a man discussing logistics, not hostages. Here's what I'd like you to understand, Mr. Carter. I don't want you dead. You've done genuinely impressive work. What I want is for you to understand the limits of your current position and make a rational decision. What decision? Walk away. Take your team and your 11 months of excellent documentation and redirect it. The Marchetti organization in Baltimore has been significantly less managed than the Moretti operation. Federal investigators would welcome your particular skill set applied in that direction. I'll provide you with seed intelligence to get started. Mr. Webb is released unharmed. Your operation continues, just elsewhere. Another brief pause. Vincent Moretti is not worth your loyalty. He never searched for your mother. He said words that condemned her and then moved on. Whatever he's told you in the past few days, he is offering you access to a narrative that serves him, not truth that serves you. The study was very quiet. Ethan was aware of Vincent behind him, listening to one side of this, unable to hear Dolan's voice but reading the stillness of Ethan's back. And if I don't walk away, Ethan said, then I release certain documentation to 3 separate federal agencies simultaneously. Documentation that includes the full operational record of Ethan Carter's activities over the past 11 months, including the methods used to access protected federal systems, the coercion of government officials for information, and the unauthorized detention of several individuals in the course of your operations. Dolan's voice remained even. You've been operating in a very interesting legal gray area, Mr. Carter. I've been watching carefully enough to know exactly where that area ends and where federal criminal exposure begins. I don't think you want that examination. Ethan said nothing. 24 hours, Dolan said. I'll be in contact. The call ended. Ethan stood at the window for 5 seconds. Then he turned around. Vincent was watching him with the expression of a man who has heard enough to understand the shape of what just happened. He has Marcus, Ethan said. Vincent didn't ask who Marcus was. What does he want? Me to walk away from this. Ethan set his phone on the desk. He also has documentation of my operational methods, enough to create serious federal exposure if he releases it. Vincent was quiet for a moment. so he has leverage on both of us. He's been building this for a long time. Ethan looked at the phone on the desk. The trafficking operation, the financial architecture, the documentation of your conduct, the record of mine. He doesn't use any single piece as a weapon. He uses all of it together as a system, so that whichever direction you move into something he's already prepared. Then we don't move in any direction he's prepared, Vincent said. That's the idea. Ethan picked up the phone. I need your records. Everything you described tonight, all of it. Not tomorrow, right now. He looked at Vincent. And I need something else. What? Caruso is in federal holding. He called Dolan from custody. Ethan held the older man's gaze. Caruso has been with your organization for over 30 years. He helped Dolan bury my mother's letter 20 years ago. And right now, he's sitting in a federal facility that Dolan has had 24 hours to think about. He paused. If Dolan decides Caruso is a liability, he'll have him killed in custody, Vincent said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way a man says something he's known for a while. Then we lose the one person who can corroborate the letter, the one person who was actually there. Ethan picked up his jacket. I need to get to him before Dolan does. Federal holding isn't something you walk into. No. Ethan moved toward the door. But Renata Delgado can. Yep. He called Delgado from the car. She answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping, which meant she'd already heard something from the federal side about tonight's activity. He gave her 90 seconds of compressed information, Dolan, Marcus, Caruso, the timeline, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he valued most about her. When he finished, she said, You're asking me to walk into a federal detention facility after midnight and request an emergency interview with a high-profile organized crime figure who has active legal representation. Yes. A pause. On what grounds? Imminent threat to his life inside the facility. You have enough contacts in the U.S. Attorney's Office to make that credible. And if Dolan has a reach into that facility, the threat is real, which makes the grounds accurate rather than just convenient. Another pause. Longer. And if Caruso won't talk, show him the letter, not a copy, the original. Ethan turned onto the highway, pushing the speed. He knows what it is. He was there when my mother brought it to him. He made a choice then, and whatever that choice cost him, he's been living with it for 20 years. He paused. People get tired of what they carry. Delgado said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, I'll make the calls. He drove. The highway was sparse this time of night, long, straight stretches of lit asphalt between the darkness of undeveloped land. And Ethan drove through it with the particular focused blankness of someone who has too many variables in the air simultaneously to attend to any one of them, and so attends to all of them, moving each piece in his head, looking for the configuration that didn't end with someone else paying for a situation they hadn't created. Marcus was with Dolan. Dolan had 24 hours of patience on the table and a system of leverage that covered every obvious direction. Caruso was accessible for perhaps the next few hours before Dolan's reach got there. Vincent had records that could expose Dolan's financial structure, but no credibility to present them and no official channel to present them through. And Ethan had 11 months of operational documentation and a set of methods that Dolan was now weaponizing, which meant that the careful distance he'd maintained from official channels, the distance that had made the operation possible, was now the thing being used to contain him. He thought about his mother writing letters in whatever room she'd been in 20 years ago, careful letters to a man she still, apparently, believed might listen. And he thought about those letters going into Reeves's hands and into a drawer somewhere, and staying there for 2 decades while Naomi Carter moved through cities and raised her son and got sick and died without ever knowing if any of it had reached anyone. The fury was there. It had always been there, underneath the operational discipline, the way a current runs under still water. He'd been managing it for 11 months, using it as fuel without letting it become direction, keeping it at arm's length with the part of him that had learned, in the military and after, that emotion was a tool and tools needed to be handled rather than wielded. He was having a harder time with that right now. His phone rang. Not Delgado, not Vincent. A number he didn't recognize, different from the one Dolan had used. He answered. Ethan Carter. A woman's voice. Not old, middle-aged, precise, with the particular clipped quality of someone who is accustomed to delivering information quickly and without excess. My name is Vera Solis. I'm an independent contractor. I was engaged by Frank Dolan 14 months ago to conduct surveillance on your operation. Ethan said nothing. I've been watching you for 14 months, she said. I know your team, your methods, your locations, your contacts. I've been feeding that information to Dolan on a regular reporting schedule. A pause. I'm calling you because 2 hours ago Dolan asked me to do something I'm not going to do. What did he ask? He has your associate, Marcus Webb. She said it straightforwardly, not as a threat, but as information. He asked me to ensure that if your response to his offer is anything other than compliance, Mr. Webb doesn't leave the location he's currently being held in. Another pause. I'm not an executioner. That's not the contract I signed. Why are you calling me? Because the alternative is watching a situation I helped create get worse than it needs to be, and I've done enough of that in my career. Her voice stayed level. I know where Marcus Webb is. I can give you the location. What you do with it is your decision. Ethan gripped the wheel. And what do you want in exchange? Nothing permanent, just out of this specific situation in a way that doesn't involve a federal indictment. A very brief pause. I'm not a good person, Mr. Carter. I want to be clear about that. I surveilled your operation for a man who used the information to hurt people. I'm not calling you because I've had a change of character. I'm calling you because Dolan's asking me to cross a line I drew for myself a long time ago, and I keep that line because it's the only one I've got. The highway stretched ahead in the headlights. Give me the location, Ethan said. She gave it to him. A warehouse, different from the one where he'd met Vincent, different from the print shop, a location in the port district that his team had mapped months ago as a secondary Moretti logistics facility, which meant Dolan was using Moretti infrastructure, which meant he was more deeply embedded in the operational architecture than even Vincent had described. One more thing, Vera Solis said, and something in her voice changed slightly. Not softer, but different. There's something at that location besides your associate. Dolan's been consolidating documentation there, physical records, external drives, everything he's accumulated on both you and Moretti. If he burns that location or moves the material before you get there, I understand, Ethan said. Then you understand that you have maybe 3 hours before he does one or the other. The call ended. Ethan drove for 30 seconds in silence. Then he called Chen and gave him the location and said, 30 minutes. I need you, Reyes, and whoever else is reachable. No contact until I arrive. He ended the call and pressed the accelerator, and the highway moved faster beneath him, and he thought about 24 hours of patience Dolan had offered and understood now that it had never been patience. It had been the time Dolan needed to move what he needed to move and burn what he needed to burn and be gone before any of it could be used against him. 3 hours. He had 3 hours to get Marcus out, secure the documentation, and prevent Frank Dolan, who had spent 22 years building a system specifically designed to be impossible to dismantle from any direction, from disappearing into the infrastructure he'd spent 2 decades quietly constructing for exactly this exit. He drove into the dark with his hand steady on the wheel and the cold current of the Fury finally, for the first time in 11 months, running closer to the surface than he could entirely manage. He got there in 22 minutes. Chen and Reyes were already on the perimeter when Ethan arrived, having come from 2 different directions and established positions at the northeast and southwest corners of the block. The warehouse was a long, low-slung concrete structure that backed up against a drainage canal, one of those port district buildings that had been repurposed so many times its original function was impossible to guess. Loading bays on the south face, a single pedestrian entrance on the north, no windows on the ground level, a row of ventilation panels near the roofline that bled pale yellow light into the dark above. Someone was inside. More than one someone. Ethan crouched beside Chen behind the cover of a parked flatbed trailer and took 30 seconds to read the building. The light distribution, the shadow movement visible through the ventilation gaps, the position of the one vehicle parked at the south bay, a dark sedan that was running, exhaust curling white in the cold. Running engine. Someone was planning to leave. How many? He said. 2 confirmed on the exterior, northeast corner, and south bay door. Interior unknown. Chen kept his voice down, eyes on the building. The South Bay's been partially open since I got here. I can see movement inside, but not detail. Vehicle's running. Been running since I arrived. Ethan looked at the sedan. The exhaust. The partially open bay door. He ran the arithmetic. Dolan's moving the documentation. He's loading it now. Reyes's voice in his earpiece. Southwest corner. I've got a visual on a man carrying boxes from the interior to the vehicle. Can't confirm identity. Don't move yet. Ethan scanned the roofline. Marcus is inside. Until I know where, nothing that risks a response toward him. He turned to Chen. The pedestrian entrance, north side. Fastest route to the interior? Straight corridor, maybe 30 feet, opens to the main floor. I walked this building 4 months ago during the mapping operation. Is the corridor lit? Was. Depends on what they've done with it tonight. Ethan made the decision in the time it took to exhale. I go in the north entrance. You take the exterior guard at the northeast corner. Quietly, I need no noise. Reyes holds the southwest and prevents that vehicle from leaving. He looked at Chen. Nobody goes loud until I do. And if it goes loud before you're ready, then it goes loud. He checked his watch. Move in 90 seconds. He went around the east side of the building, staying in the shadow of the drainage canal embankment, moving fast and low over broken ground that wanted to turn his ankle with every step. The cold air was sharp in his lungs. He could hear the canal water moving in the dark below the embankment, and somewhere further away the sound of the port, machinery, a distant horn, and underneath all of it his own heartbeat, which he was aware of the way he'd been aware of it in the warehouse when he'd read his mother's letter, that biological insistence on making itself known. He reached the north entrance. Steel door, commercial handle, no visible lock mechanism on the exterior, which meant either it was unlocked or the lock was electronic and controlled from inside. He put his hand on the handle and applied gentle pressure. It opened. Either careless or deliberate. He filed both possibilities and went in. The corridor was dim, one fluorescent tube working at the far end, the other dead. And it smelled of concrete dust and old machine oil and something more recent, something chemical that he couldn't immediately identify. He moved down it with his back to the wall and his eyes on the rectangle of light at the far end where the corridor opened onto the main floor. He heard voices before he reached it, 2 men talking in the low, functional way of people working, not having a conversation. The scrape of something heavy being moved, a brief electronic sound, a device, a scanner, something being checked. He reached the edge of the corridor and looked around the corner. The main floor was large, maybe 8,000 square feet of open concrete, industrial shelving along the east wall, the loading bay open at the south end where the sedan sat idling with its rear doors open. 3 men were working, moving flat plastic cases and document boxes from a stack in the center of the floor toward the vehicle. A 4th man stood to one side with a tablet, checking things off with the mechanical attention of someone inventorying. Dolan was not among them. Marcus was. He was seated against the west wall, wrists secured to a support column with what looked like zip restraints, ankles tied. His head was up and his eyes were open, alert, scanning the room with the steady assessment of a man who is conserving energy rather than giving up. And from this distance, Ethan could see the dried blood on the side of his face from whatever had happened at the print shop, but nothing that suggested worse injury. Ethan pulled back from the corner. 4 men visible. Dolan elsewhere in the building or already gone. Marcus secured but functional. The vehicle loading, maybe half the material already loaded from the size of the remaining stack. He had minutes, not much more. He went back to his earpiece. Subvocal, barely above a breath. Marcus is on the west wall, column secured. 4 hostiles on the main floor, Dolan not visible. I need a distraction at the South Bay, exterior, loud enough to pull at least 2 of them toward the vehicle. Give me 20 seconds after the distraction starts. Reyes's voice. Understood. On your mark. He pressed himself back against the corridor wall and breathed once, slowly, and then, mark. From outside came the sound of the sedan's alarm. Reyes had done something to it, triggered the panic function, or hit it hard enough to set it off. And the alarm cut through the warehouse noise like something splitting, and Ethan was moving before the first echo. He came around the corner fast and low, and he had the specific advantage of knowing exactly where he was going, and the four men on the floor didn't. And in the 2 seconds it took two of them to turn toward the South Bay and one of them to reach for something on the shelf beside him, Ethan had crossed half the floor. He took the nearest man down first, the one reaching for the shelf, using the man's own momentum and the angle of his reach. A controlled takedown that put him on the concrete hard enough to end his participation. The second man turned and had just enough time to register what was happening before Ethan's elbow connected with his jaw, and he went sideways into the shelving unit, and the shelving unit rang like a bell and didn't fall. The third man was fast. He came around the document stack with something in his hand, and Ethan caught the wrist rather than backing away, redirected the motion, and they were briefly close enough that Ethan could hear the man's breathing. Ragged, scared, younger than he'd looked from across the room, before the wrist lock brought him down to one knee and a short strike ended it. 4 seconds. 3 men down. The fourth, the one with the tablet, had backed toward the South Bay and was shouting something, not at Ethan, but outward, into the night through the open bay, calling for the exterior guards. Ethan was across the remaining distance in 3 steps, and had the man's arm bent at an angle that prevented any further shouting with a precision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 11 months of targeting the people who'd made Naomi Carter's life a documented emergency. "Where is Dolan?" he said. The man's face was pressed sideways against the hood of the sedan, which was still alarming, the sound filling the warehouse. He said nothing. Ethan applied 2 degrees more pressure. "Where?" "Office," gasped. "Back of the building, east side. There's an office." He let go, stepped back, assessed. The 2 exterior guards would be coming through the bay in seconds. He turned to Marcus. The zip ties came apart with the folding knife he carried in his jacket's inside pocket. 2 cuts, wrists, then the ankle binding. And Marcus stood up with the careful movement of a man who has been in one position long enough that standing is a project. "Can you run?" Ethan said. "Probably not the right word for it." Marcus tested his weight. "But I can move." "Then move!" He pressed the knife into Marcus's hand. "North corridor, exterior, find Reyes. Do not stop." "Dolan." "I'll find Dolan." Marcus looked at him for 1 second with the expression of a man who has many objections and understands exactly none of them will be received. Then he went. The 2 exterior guards came through the South Bay at a run, and Ethan was no longer where they expected him to be, which was beside Marcus, and by the time they recalibrated, he had already moved east along the back wall toward the office the man with the tablet had described, and the guards were dealing with the 3 men on the floor who were in various states of recovery and demanding assistance. He found the office. It was a glass-walled enclosure in the southeast corner, the kind of site management office that overlooked the floor, with a door that opened inward and lights that were fully on inside. He could see through the glass before he reached it. Dolan was at the desk. He was maybe 60, lean and gray-haired, with the build of a man who had kept himself in deliberate condition. The kind of deliberate that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. He was doing something with a laptop and a portable drive, and he was doing it with the focused calm of a man who'd planned for exactly this contingency, which he had. Because Frank Dolan had been planning for contingencies for 22 years. He looked up when Ethan came through the door. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't stand. He looked at Ethan across the desk with an expression that was assessment, not fear, and he closed the laptop with a deliberate motion that made Ethan's jaw tighten because it meant something on that drive had either been completed or deleted. "You made good time," Dolan said. Ethan crossed the office in 4 steps and put both hands on the desk and looked at the man directly. "Where's the drive?" "Which drive?" "The one you just pulled from that laptop." Dolan leaned back in his chair, and his hand rested on the desk surface, near the laptop, in an attitude of perfect ease that was absolutely performed and absolutely convincing. This was a man who had sat in difficult rooms for decades and understood that composure was its own form of offense. "Your associate is free," Dolan said. "I can tell by the alarm and the general noise level that things have not gone the way I planned in the past 4 minutes. He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not going to pretend that part isn't a setback." "The drive. You're focused." He nodded slightly. "I understand. Your mother was the same way, from what I understand of her." single-minded when the situation required it. He paused. That quality is actually more Moretti than Carter, if you want the truth. The words landed with the precision of something thrown to distract, and Ethan recognized them as such, and still felt them. "I'm not interested in your analysis," he said. "The documentation you've been accumulating, the records of Vincent's conduct, the records of my operation, the financial architecture, all of it. Where is it?" "Distributed," Dolan said. "You didn't think I'd keep it in one location." He looked at Ethan steadily. "Some of it is in this building. Some of it is already in transit to individuals who have standing instructions to act on it if they don't receive a specific communication from me within a set time frame." He paused. "That's a dead man's switch, Mr. Carter. It's not an idle threat. It existed before tonight, and it exists now, regardless of what happens in this room." Ethan looked at him. "You've had 22 years to build your exit strategy." "I've had 22 years to make sure I always had options." Dolan's voice remained even. "That's not the same thing as an exit strategy. An exit strategy implies I intended to leave. I never intended to leave. I intended to run the organization while Vincent held the title, for as long as that arrangement served everyone's interests." Something shifted in his expression. Minimal, but there. "What I did not intend was for a 20-year-old decision about a woman and a letter to come apart at the seams because a dying courier developed a conscience." "You mean my mother," Ethan said. "I mean the situation," Dolan said. "I mean the specific circumstances that created you as a problem, rather than as someone who simply didn't exist." The office was very warm compared to the warehouse floor. Ethan could feel the heat on his face and the sweat at the back of his neck and the weight of the evening, the full accumulated weight of it, Marcus on the floor of the print shop, the letter in his jacket, the sedan being loaded, Dolan sitting in this chair with 22 years of constructed security and the specific composure of a man who has never once, in 2 decades of careful management, had to sit in a room where someone could simply reach across a desk. "Your dead man's switch," Ethan said. "It triggers if you don't send a communication." "Within a specific time frame, yes." "How long?" Dolan looked at him. For the first time, something behind the composure flickered. Not fear, but calculation. A man working out what the question meant before deciding whether to answer it. 6 hours, he said. "From this point." "Then we have 6 hours." Ethan pulled the chair from the corner of the office, set it in front of the desk, and sat down. He looked at Dolan across the closed laptop. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where every piece of that documentation is, every location, every individual holding it, every digital repository, and then you're going to help me secure it. And if I don't, then in 6 hours, your switch triggers and federal agencies receive documentation of Vincent Moretti's conduct, which creates open federal proceedings, which creates open examination of every financial and operational thread connected to that investigation." Ethan held the other man's gaze. "Including you, including your shadow infrastructure, including the 22-year parallel economy you've been building inside a criminal organization, which is its own criminal organization, and one that you've been managing from a position of false trust, which adds a range of additional charges." He paused. "Your switch burns Vincent. It burns me somewhat, though I'll take that risk. And it burns you most completely of all, because the people you've sent that documentation to, you think they'll honor standing instructions from a man who's in federal custody? Or do you think they'll make their own calculations about what's most useful to them?" Dolan was very still. "You've been the smartest man in every room for 2 decades, Ethan said. "I'm asking you to be the smartest man in this room for the next 6 hours." A long silence. The sedan alarm had stopped. The warehouse outside the glass was quiet in a way that suggested Chen and Reyes had managed the exterior situation, though Ethan couldn't confirm it and didn't look away from Dolan to check. "What do I get?" Dolan said. "You get a conversation with Renata Delgado instead of a federal arrest conducted by people who have no interest in a conversation." Ethan didn't soften it. "That's what's available. Take it or leave it." Dolan looked at him for a long moment. The composure was still there. It would probably always be there. It was too deeply built to collapse in a single evening. But beneath it, something had shifted. The shift of a man who has run his calculations and arrived at an answer he doesn't like and is deciding whether to accept the answer or keep running. He reached into his jacket. Ethan's hand moved to the desk surface, ready, and Dolan saw it, and his mouth compressed slightly. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of a point, and produced not a weapon but a small external drive. He set it on the desk between them. "The financial records," Dolan said. 22 years. Everything. He looked at the drive. "That's a starting point, not a complete answer." "I know." Ethan picked up the drive. "Start talking." Bochat. He talked for 40 minutes. Ethan didn't record it. Recording it would have created its own legal complications, and Dolan knew that too, which was perhaps why he was willing to speak at all, or perhaps because the calculation had shifted in ways that made speech more strategically useful than silence. Either way, the words came, measured and organized, and Ethan listened and held each piece in his memory and mapped it against what he already knew and felt. The architecture assembled itself into something that, for the first time in 11 months, was actually complete. The documentation was in 4 locations, 2 physical, 2 digital. Dolan gave him the addresses, the access credentials, the contact information for the 2 individuals holding material on standing instruction. He gave it with the specific resignation of a man surrendering a hand he's been holding for a long time, not dramatically but practically, the way you put down something heavy when you've accepted that carrying it further is no longer possible. At the 30-minute mark, Ethan's phone buzzed. "Marcus, from outside. Reyes has the perimeter. Chen has the exterior secured. What's your status?" Ethan typed back one word. "Talking." At the 40-minute mark, Dolan stopped. He looked at Ethan across the desk with something that might have been, in a different man, in a different conversation, a kind of exhausted honesty. "The woman," he said. "Your mother. I want you to understand something, not because it changes what I did, but because it's true." He paused. "She was the one person in Vincent's life who saw clearly. That's why she was dangerous. Not because she would have acted against the organization. She wouldn't have. She loved him. That was obvious to anyone who looked, but because she would have eventually seen me. And people who see clearly are the ones you can't manage." He stopped. "That's all. I'm not asking for anything from it. I just want it said." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "It's said," he answered and stood up. So, he brought Dolan out through the north corridor at gunpoint, Chen's weapon, which Chen had passed to Ethan without comment when he met them at the corridor entrance, and into the cold night air where the team was assembled with the specific organized exhaustion of people who have managed a complex situation on limited sleep and are running on the particular fuel of having managed it. Marcus was standing by the drainage canal embankment. He looked bad in the way he'd looked bad before. The shoulder, the head, the accumulated damage of an evening that had asked more of him than any evening had a right to. But he was standing, and when Ethan came out with Dolan, he looked at the 2 of them and then at Ethan's face, and whatever he read there made him exhale slowly through his nose and nod. Ethan called Delgado. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something." "I have Dolan. I have the drive. I have 4 locations where his documentation is held, and I have 40 minutes of verbal accounting of the complete financial structure he's been running inside the Moretti organization for 22 years. He looked at the sky, cloud-covered, starting to lighten at the eastern edge, the first gray of pre-dawn beginning to assert itself. "And I need your people to move on those 4 locations before 6 hours from now, not after, before." A pause. "I'm going to need a federal warrant for 2 of those locations in the next 4 hours. "You have what you need to get them." He watched Dolan standing between Chen and Reyes, looking at the canal with the detached expression of a man who has accepted his situation. "One more thing." "Of course there is." "Sal Caruso, federal holding. He needs to be moved to protective custody tonight. Not tomorrow, not in the morning, tonight. Can that happen?" If the threat to his life is credible, it's credible, then yes. A pause. "Ethan, are we done? Is this the end of it?" He looked at the 4 locations on his phone, the drive in his jacket pocket, the sky getting lighter. He thought about Dolan's documentation of Vincent's conduct, 22 years of material, enough to end a career and a freedom, and about Vincent's study and the chair he'd sat in for an hour, while an old man told him the truth about something that couldn't be fixed. Almost, he said. He ended the call and turned and found Vincent Moretti standing 20 feet away, which meant Vincent had followed him here, or had been told to come here by someone, or had done the thing powerful men sometimes do when they've run out of managed options and arrived at a moment that requires something other than management. The sky was going gray above the canal. The morning was coming in off the water, cold and salt-edged, and Dolan stood between two of Ethan's people looking at the ground, and Marcus was alive and standing, and the drive was in Ethan's pocket, and the 6-hour window was contracting toward its resolution. Vincent looked at Ethan across 20 feet of broken ground with the face of a man who has been in hard rooms and hard conversations for 50 years and has arrived at something he doesn't have a prepared position for. "Is it done?" Vincent said. "Not yet." Ethan looked at him. "But close." He watched the older man's face, the jaw, the eyes, the particular arrangement of a face that had made decisions for decades that he was now standing in the cold morning consequence of. And he felt the complexity of it the way you feel something that has too many parts to resolve into a single reaction. And he let it be complex, because the alternative was to simplify something that didn't deserve simplification. "There's something I need you to do," Ethan said. "It's going to be the hardest thing I ask of you. Harder than the documentation, harder than the cooperation with Delgado." He paused. "I need you to stand in front of the people Dolan's been managing and the people your organization has been managing and say what happened. Not a version of it, not a managed account." "What happened?" He held Vincent's gaze. "Including the part about my mother, including what you said and what you chose and what those choices cost." The canal moved in the dark below the embankment. Vincent Moretti stood in the gray light of early morning looking at his son, and said nothing for a long moment, and the nothing was not refusal, but the sound of a man locating the capacity for something he hadn't known he still had. "And if I do," he said finally, "then we finish this," Ethan said. The morning came in off the water, and the city began, somewhere in the distance, to wake up, and the 6-hour window kept contracting, and Frank Dolan looked at the ground between his feet, and Marcus stood by the canal with his damaged shoulder and his steady eyes, and Ethan Carter stood in the early light of a day that was going to demand everything and waited for his father to answer. Vincent said yes. He didn't say it with words. He said it by looking at Ethan for 3 more seconds in the gray morning light, and then turning toward the canal and standing there with his hands at his sides. And the way he stood, not the controlled posture of a man managing a room, but the posture of a man who has put something down and hasn't yet adjusted to the absence of its weight, was its own kind of answer. Ethan read it and didn't push for more. Not yet. There would be time for the words later, and the words would matter less than what came after them anyway. He turned back to the immediate work, because the immediate work was not finished. The 6-hour window was now closer to 5. Delgado had people moving on 3 of the 4 documentation locations within the hour, and the 4th, a digital repository held by an attorney in another city who had standing instructions from Dolan and no particular loyalty beyond the retainer he'd been paid, was addressed when Ethan called the number Dolan had provided and said 3 specific words that Dolan, standing 10 feet away with Chen's hand on his arm, confirmed were the abort code. The attorney on the other end asked no questions. The standing instructions were dissolved. The repository access was transferred. Frank Dolan stood through this process with his hands zip-tied in front of him, a courtesy Ethan had extended because the man was 60 and had cooperated, and because Ethan was not in the business of cruelty for its own sake, and watched it happen with the specific attention of a man memorizing the experience of losing something he'd spent decades building. He didn't speak during it. When it was done, he looked at Ethan and said one thing. "I need you to know that I understood 20 years ago exactly what I was doing to her." His voice was as precise as it had been in the office, but something in it was different, stripped of the performance quality, the careful calibration, just words. Not an accident, not a miscalculation, a deliberate choice made with full knowledge. He paused. "I'm telling you because I think you're the kind of person who needs the truth to be acknowledged rather than managed, and because I'm tired of managing it." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. She knew too. She wrote it in the last letter. He held the man's gaze. That's not absolution, but it's the record. Dolan nodded once, minimally, and looked away. Reyes drove him to the federal holding location where Delgado was waiting, which had been arranged in the 20 minutes between Ethan's call and the first light of morning properly arriving. Ethan watched the vehicle leave and then stood in the warehouse lot with Chen and Marcus and the canal smell and the growing light and felt the particular quality of silence that follows the end of a sustained effort. Not peace, not satisfaction, something more like the absence of immediate demand, which the body registers as rest even when the mind is still moving. Marcus was sitting on the embankment, which was less a choice than a concession to his shoulder and the events of the evening. He looked at Ethan with the expression that had become, over 11 months, Ethan's primary read on whether a situation was actually stable or just temporarily quiet. "It's stable," Ethan said, before Marcus could ask. "I wasn't going to ask." "You were thinking it very loudly." Marcus looked at the canal. "Caruso." "Delgado's people are moving him to protective custody tonight. He'll be interviewed separately from the Dolan proceedings." Ethan crouched beside the embankment, bringing himself to eye level with Marcus. "He's going to have to talk about the letter, about my mother coming to him, about the 48 hours. He's been carrying that for 20 years. "Yes." Ethan picked up a piece of broken concrete from the embankment edge and turned it in his hand. People carry things until they can't, then they put them down or they break. Either way, the carrying stops. Marcus looked at him. "How are you?" The question landed differently than it usually did, which was not usually how Marcus asked questions. He was precise, specific, operational. And Ethan understood that it was a real question, not a check-in. He thought about how to answer it honestly without making it larger than it was, which was a habit he'd developed young and maintained rigorously, and which was, he was beginning to understand, not entirely a virtue. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me in a week. I'll remember." "I know you will." Ethan stood up. He looked at the eastern sky, which was fully light now, the city asserting itself against the morning in the gradual way of cities. Sounds first, then movement, then the particular quality of occupied space that an urban environment produces when enough people wake up simultaneously and start moving through it. "Go get your shoulder properly looked at. And you." "I have one more thing to do." Chad. He found Vincent where he'd left him, which was standing by the canal. The older man hadn't moved significantly in the time Ethan had spent on the documentation logistics. He'd shifted perhaps 10 feet north along the embankment, which might have been walking, or might have been simply the slow drift of a man whose attention was elsewhere. When Ethan approached, he turned, and in the full morning light, without the compression of crisis, Vincent Moretti looked his age in a way he hadn't the night before. Not diminished, just accurate. "Delgado will want you available today," Ethan said. "Not in custody. She'll give you the courtesy of a voluntary interview, at least initially, given the cooperation, but today. This morning, if possible." "I understand. The documentation Dolan held on your conduct, most of it is now in federal hands through channels that make its provenance complicated to prosecute cleanly. That's not immunity, it's time." Ethan looked at him. "What you do with that time is the thing that determines what the next 5 years look like." Vincent held his gaze. "You're telling me to get ahead of it. I'm telling you that the option exists. It won't exist indefinitely. And you," Vincent's voice was careful, "what happens to you? Dolan's records of your methods are now part of a federal evidence stream that Delgado controls, and Delgado has significant interest in the outcome of the investigation those methods supported." Ethan kept his voice level. "There will be conversations. There will be a period of legal complexity. I've accepted that." Vincent looked at him for a moment. "You accepted it before tonight." "Yes." "When you decided to go after Dolan instead of walking away." "When I decided to go after your organization 11 months ago." Ethan looked at the canal. The water caught the morning light in shifting patterns, ordinary and indifferent. "I knew what I was building toward. I knew the methods would eventually become part of the story. I decided the story was worth it." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother made the same kind of calculation. She was protecting you, and she knew the cost, and she paid it without telling anyone what it cost her. She just kept going." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't know her well enough at the end. I thought I knew her completely, and I knew almost nothing. Dolan understood that better than I did. That's the thing I can't—" He stopped again. "Don't," Ethan said. Vincent looked at him. "Don't finish that sentence by making it about what you can't live with." Ethan turned to face him fully. "She's gone. What you couldn't do for her then, you can't do now. The only thing that's still available is the part that's left. The record, the truth. The people who were hurt by the same organization that hurt her." He paused. "Start there." A long silence. The canal moved. Somewhere above the embankment a bird called once and didn't repeat itself. "You're very like her," Vincent said quietly. "I thought, when I first saw you, that you were like me. The way you move, the way you assess a room. But it's her. The underneath of it is her." Ethan said nothing to that. He let it stand without a response because it didn't need one, and because he wasn't sure what response it deserved, and because some things are true in a way that speaking about them only diminishes them. "Call Delgado," he said. "Use my number. She's expecting to hear from someone in your position today." He took a card from his jacket and handed it over. "And Vincent." The older man looked up at the use of his name. It was the first time Ethan had used it directly. They both noticed. "Whatever you say today, tomorrow, in front of Delgado's people or anyone else, say it completely. Not strategically, not the version that protects the most of what's left." He held the man's gaze. "She deserves complete." Vincent Moretti looked at the card in his hand, and then at his son, and then at the canal, and nodded once. Not the managed nod of a controlled man in a controlled situation, but the nod of someone who has arrived, late and at significant cost, at a decision they should have made a long time ago and have run out of reasons to delay. Ethan left him there and walked back toward where his car was parked, and he did not look back, and the morning continued to arrive around him in its unhurried way, indifferent to everything that had happened in the dark. Sal Caruso talked. He talked for 6 hours across 2 sessions, with his attorney present for the second and not, at Caruso's own insistence, for the first. Renata Delgado conducted both sessions herself, which was unusual and which she justified to her colleagues on the grounds that the material was too sensitive for delegation, which was true and also not the complete reason. Caruso confirmed the letter. He confirmed that Naomi Carter had come to him with what she'd found on Dolan, and he confirmed what he'd done with the 48 hours she'd given him. He said it without asking for anything in return, which Delgado noted, and which Ethan, reading the session transcript 2 days later, understood was the act of a man who had stopped negotiating with the thing he carried. He also provided, from memory, a memory that had apparently kept the details with the fidelity of something often returned to. The name of the man in the Marchetti organization who had been Dolan's contact, the specific nature of the financial arrangement between them, and the date on which Dolan had first approached him, Caruso, about the plan to remove Naomi from the situation. Caruso had declined to participate in the removal. He'd declined to participate, and then he'd bought 48 hours and used them to say nothing, which was a different kind of participation, and he said that too. He said it with the flat effect of a man who has been very specific with himself about what he did and has stopped trying to find a more comfortable version. The Marchetti contact, when federal agents reached him 72 hours later through a process that involved 3 separate jurisdictions and a significant amount of the documentation from Dolan's drive, confirmed the arrangement. He was less forthcoming than Caruso, but the documentation was sufficient to make his cooperation a formality rather than a necessity. Frank Dolan was indicted on 47 counts across 3 federal jurisdictions, including charges that would take 3 years to fully prosecute, and which, Delgado told Ethan in a phone call from which she kept her voice carefully neutral, were the most comprehensive organized crime indictment her office had produced in 2 decades. She said this without praise for anyone specifically, which was professionally appropriate and, personally, Ethan suspected, not entirely how she felt. He accepted the neutrality with the graciousness it deserved. Man. The conversation with Delgado about Ethan's own methods happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the warehouse, in her office on the 14th floor with the door closed and no one else present. She laid it out without preamble. The specific activities that created federal exposure, the legal framework within which those activities existed, and the realistic range of outcomes given the current disposition of the federal investigation Ethan's work had initiated and sustained. She was thorough and she was honest, and she did not soften the parts that didn't soften easily. When she finished, Ethan sat across from her and said, "What's the path that doesn't end with me in a courtroom?" Cooperation agreement. You've been providing material assistance to federal investigations. I can document that from my end going back 11 months. The unauthorized access and the detention issues are addressable within a cooperation framework if the U.S. attorney is motivated to address them. She looked at him steadily. The U.S. attorney is currently extremely motivated by the Dolan indictment and the Moretti cooperation, both of which came directly from your work. Motivated enough that I've had a conversation with her office that I can't officially tell you about, but which I'm telling you about. And the things that aren't addressable. There will be a period of supervised engagement with federal oversight, formal consultation rather than independent operation. A pause. You'd be working inside the system rather than alongside it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long? 2 years minimum, potentially 3. She held his gaze. I know that's not what you built. I know the independence was part of how you worked and part of why it worked. But you went as far as you could go outside the system, and now the system is caught up. She paused. That's not a failure. That's what it looks like when something succeeds. He looked at the window, the city outside, ordinary and ongoing. 2 years. Working with people who are actually motivated to use what you know, that's not nothing. No, he said, it's not nothing. He signed the cooperation agreement the following Monday. Marcus, whose shoulder had healed functionally, if not completely, signed a parallel agreement the same day. Chen and Reyes were addressed separately through a process that Delgado managed with the specific competence she brought to everything she managed, and which resulted in outcomes that were, for all of them, better than the exposure warranted. None of them discussed it as a victory. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something that had needed ending and the beginning of something that hadn't been named yet. The Moretti estate proceedings took 8 months. Vincent cooperated, as Ethan had asked him to, completely, not strategically, with a thoroughness that his attorney found professionally alarming and that Delgado's office found, she told Ethan in one of their periodic check-in calls, remarkable. He gave the financial records, the operational history, the political connections, the names of individuals who had provided protection and received payment for it. He gave it with the kind of exhaustive honesty that goes beyond legal obligation into something that is its own form of accounting. The criminal charges against Vincent were significant, but given his age and his cooperation and the specific circumstances of Dolan's 22-year manipulation of the organization's direction, not terminal. Delgado's office and Vincent's attorney reached an agreement that involved substantial asset forfeiture, permanent divestiture from all criminal operations, and a period of supervised conditions that amounted, practically, to a retirement the court would be watching. The Moretti name disappeared from the criminal landscape with a completeness that surprised people who had expected the empire to fracture into successor factions. It didn't fracture because Vincent had, in his complete cooperation, specifically identified and assisted in the dismantling of the internal structures that would have allowed factions to form. He did this without being asked. When Delgado mentioned it to Ethan, she noted that it appeared deliberate. Ethan said, "It was." He knew because Vincent had told him in one of the 3 conversations they had during the 8 months of proceedings, not frequent, not comfortable, conducted with the careful awkwardness of 2 people learning the dimensions of something that has no template, that the dismantling was the thing he could do. He couldn't undo the decades. He couldn't give Naomi Carter back the years the lie had taken. He couldn't reconstruct what the organization had damaged in the communities it had operated in for 30 years. But he could make sure the infrastructure that had enabled all of it was not inherited by anyone, that the machine was genuinely disassembled rather than transferred. "It's not enough," Vincent had said in the second of those conversations. They were in a coffee shop, which had been Ethan's choice of location because it was ordinary and public and neutral in a way that a private meeting could not be, and because Ethan had decided, somewhere in the weeks after the warehouse, that ordinary was what he wanted these conversations to be. Not charged, not historic, just two people at a table with coffee getting slightly cold between them. "I know it's not enough." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not. I'm doing it anyway." "I know." Vincent had looked at the table for a moment. "Does that count for anything? In your accounting?" Ethan had thought about how to answer that honestly. "It counts as what it is," he said finally, "which is someone doing the right thing late. That's real. It's not the same as doing it when it would have mattered most, but it's real." Vincent had nodded and picked up his coffee, and they had sat in the ordinary public noise of the coffee shop for another 20 minutes and talked about things that were not the case or the proceedings or the history, and neither of them had been entirely comfortable and neither of them had left before the other. And that was the closest thing to a beginning that was available to them, and Ethan had decided it was enough to work with. He went back to the city where his mother had died. Not immediately. It was 6 months after the warehouse, after the indictments and the agreements, and the first weeks of the cooperative consultation work that was, as Delgado had said, not nothing. He went on a Tuesday in early spring, when the weather had turned uncertain, and the city was in the particular transitional state of not quite cold and not yet warm, and he drove to the neighborhood where the rented room had been and parked in front of the building and sat in the car for a while. He wasn't sure what he was doing there. That was honest. He'd made the trip on instinct rather than plan, which was unusual for him, and he was trying to decide whether to attribute that to grief or to something else, and he wasn't sure the distinction mattered. He had the 4 letters. He'd made copies for Delgado's evidence file and kept the originals, which no one had objected to. He had them in the inside pocket of his jacket, which was where he'd been keeping them since the night in Vincent's study. A weight he was aware of in the specific way you become aware of things that belong to you. He got out of the car and walked to the building's entrance and stood on the steps for a moment. The city moved around him. A woman walking a dog, 2 kids on bicycles, the sound of someone's radio through an open window 2 floors up. And he stood in it and let it be ordinary. She'd spent 8 years here. Out of all the cities, this one had held her longest, which he took to mean something. Not that it was the best of them, maybe, but that she'd been tired of moving and had decided, consciously or not, that this was far enough. That the distance she'd put between herself and Vincent Moretti's city was finally sufficient. That she could stop running and just live, for a while, in whatever way was available. He didn't go inside. There was nothing to go inside for. Different tenants, different life, a room that had no memory of her except in him. He stood on the steps for a few minutes and then walked back to the car and drove to the cemetery where she was buried, which was the actual destination he'd been avoiding naming to himself for the entire drive. It was a small cemetery, well-maintained, the kind of place that a city sustains quietly without many people knowing it's there. Her grave had a stone he'd chosen 6 months ago and hadn't seen since it was placed. There had been too much happening to come back before now, or he'd told himself there was, which was possibly the same thing. He stood in front of it. The stone said her name and her dates and nothing else, because he hadn't been able to find a phrase that was both true and sufficient, and he decided that her name was sufficient on its own, that a woman who had lived the way she'd lived didn't need to be summarized. He reached into his jacket and took out the 4 letters. He stood holding them for a moment, the paper worn at the folds, the handwriting faded, the weight of them slight in a way that was completely inconsistent with what they actually were. "He's doing it," he said. He wasn't sure when he'd decided to speak. The words came out with the specific awkwardness of someone who doesn't do this, who has no practice with it. "The dismantling, the cooperation. It's real. I've watched it closely enough to know the difference." He paused. "I know you don't need me to report to you. I know that's not... I just wanted you to know that I'm not letting it be managed. I'm watching it." The cemetery was quiet. A wind moved through the trees at the south edge, brief and then gone. "The letters were real," he said. "He knows that now." Your name is in federal records as a victim rather than a perpetrator. That's that's the official record. That's the thing that persists. He paused again, and this time the pause was longer, because what came next was the thing he'd been carrying the longest, the thing underneath the operation and the drive and the 11 months of precise and relentless work, and he'd never said it out loud, not to Marcus, not to Delgado, not to anyone. "I'm okay," he said. "I know you spent a long time worrying about that, whether I would be. I know you couldn't always tell." He looked at her name on the stone, the chiseled letters clean in the spring light. "I'm not perfect. I made choices over the past year that are going to take time to fully account for, and there are things I could have done differently and things I probably can't change. But I'm okay." He let the words settle. "I wanted you to know." He put the letters back in his pocket. He stood there for a few more minutes, not speaking, just standing in the way you stand when you've said what you came to say, and you're not ready to leave yet, but you know you will be soon. The wind came back through the trees, and the cemetery was quiet, and the city existed at a distance around it, ordinary and ongoing, the way cities are. Then he left. The Moretti fortune, after asset forfeiture and the substantial settlement with federal and state agencies, was not what it had been. But it was not nothing. Vincent's legitimate holdings, the businesses that had been maintained as cover for decades, and which were, by that point, genuinely functional enterprises, retained value. And Vincent directed the management of them, under court oversight, toward a specific purpose he'd outlined in his cooperation agreement as a condition he imposed on himself rather than accepted from the court. Jobs, first. The neighborhoods the organization had controlled and extracted from for 30 years had economies that had been structured around that extraction, and when the structure was removed, the economies needed replacement. The legitimate businesses provided some of that. Not enough, but some. And Vincent pushed them toward it with the specific focus of a man who has identified the one productive thing still available to him and is not wasting time on anything else. The families, the people from Caruso's truck, and the others they'd identified in the records Dolan had kept, which were meticulous because Dolan was meticulous about everything, were connected to services through channels that Delgado established and that Ethan, in his consultative capacity, helped navigate. It was slow work. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside and looks from the inside. Like one conversation and then another, each one addressing something specific and leaving something else still needing to be addressed. Ethan did it. He did it alongside the federal consultation work in the hours that were his own, without announcing it or reporting it to anyone. Marcus knew, because Marcus knew most things, and occasionally came along, his shoulder fully healed by that point, his demeanor identical to what it had always been, which was steady and precise and occasionally irritatingly accurate about things Ethan was still processing. "You're not going to become him," Marcus said once. They were in a car outside a community center in one of the neighborhoods, waiting for a meeting to end so they could speak to someone inside. It was raining, which was appropriate in the way that weather is sometimes appropriate without anyone having arranged it. Ethan looked at him. "What?" "Vincent." Marcus kept his eyes on the community center door. "I've watched you doing this work for 3 months, and I've watched you watching yourself while you do it. And I think you're worried that you're going to become him, that the connection, whatever it is, that it's going to pull you toward what he was." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is that your professional assessment?" "It's my observation as someone who's been in a car with you for 3 months. Marcus paused. "You're not going to become him. You're already not him. You've been not him for 38 years without knowing what you were not being." He glanced over. "That's enough." Ethan looked at the rain on the windshield. The community center door opened, and a woman came out with an umbrella. "That's enough," he said. Not as agreement exactly, more as something he was deciding to accept. Hulk. On a Saturday in October, 8 months after the warehouse, Ethan drove to a restaurant near the edge of the city. Not the neighborhood where either of them had history, a neutral place he'd chosen with the same logic he'd applied to the coffee shop, and sat at a table by the window and waited. Vincent came in at 12:30, which was when they'd agreed, and crossed the restaurant with the slight stiffness that had been in his walk since the canal morning, and which wasn't better or worse, just present in the way that age is present in a body that has asked a great deal of itself over many decades. He sat down across from Ethan, and the waiter came, and they ordered, and the waiter left, and they sat in the Saturday lunchtime noise of the restaurant, and it was awkward, the way it was always slightly awkward, and neither of them tried to make it less so. "The Delgado review is complete," Vincent said. "Final accounting accepted by the court yesterday." "I heard. It's—" He stopped. "It's a significant reduction from what I had." "Yes." "That's appropriate." "Yes," Ethan said again. They sat with that for a moment. The food came and they ate, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of two people at lunch who are not yet comfortable in each other's presence, but have decided that the discomfort is not sufficient reason to stop trying. "There's something I want to ask you," Vincent said, when the plates were cleared and the coffee arrived. Ethan waited. "The businesses, the ones I'm directing toward the neighborhood work." He held his coffee cup in both hands. "I'd like you to have oversight of the direction, not control. I understand that would create conflicts with your current arrangement. But oversight, someone was standing to say if something is being done wrong." He looked up. "Someone I can't manage." Ethan looked at him across the table. He thought about what it meant to be the person in someone's life who couldn't be managed, and what that required from both sides of the arrangement, and whether he was willing to take that on. Not as an operation, not as a strategic engagement, but as a sustained ongoing thing with no defined endpoint and no clean success condition. "That's a long commitment," Ethan said. "Yes." Vincent held his gaze. "I know I don't have the standing to ask for a long commitment." "You don't." Ethan looked at his coffee. "But the neighborhoods do." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll think about it." Vincent nodded. He didn't push. He'd learned, in 8 months of difficult conversations with this specific person, that pushing produced exactly nothing, and that patience, genuine patience, not the managed patience of a man controlling a situation, but the actual willingness to wait for something that might not come, was the only thing that worked, and that learning it this late in his life was both necessary and insufficient and the only option available. They finished their coffee and paid and left the restaurant into the October afternoon, and on the sidewalk they stood for a moment with the city around them, ordinary and enormous and indifferent, and Ethan looked at the older man in the afternoon light and felt the complexity of him, everything he'd done and everything he hadn't done, and the specific weight of who he was to Ethan and what that meant and what it could never mean. And he held all of it without trying to resolve it into something simpler. "Next month," Ethan said. "Same place." Vincent looked at him. "If the offer's still open," Ethan said. "It'll be open," Vincent said quietly. They parted without ceremony, no embrace, no formal gesture, just the ordinary separation of two people at the end of a meal, each moving in their own direction on a Saturday afternoon. Ethan walked to his car and got in and sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the street through the windshield, the light on the buildings, the people moving through it, all the accumulated ordinary life of a city that had held this story inside it without knowing. He thought about his mother in the rented room, writing letters to a man she believed might still listen. He thought about the 48 hours Caruso had taken. He thought about Dolan's precise and patient construction of a 22-year lie, and about the letter in a dead man's drawer, and about Vincent's face in a warehouse in the middle of the night when he'd said our son and hadn't taken it back. He thought about what it cost to break a cycle. Not the dramatic cost, not the confrontation, not the legal proceedings, not the risk, but the daily cost, the continuing cost, the cost of choosing every morning to be the thing the cycle wasn't, knowing the choice would be required again tomorrow and the day after. He started the engine. The city moved around him as he pulled into traffic, and the afternoon continued its unhurried progress toward evening. And Ethan Carter drove through it carrying everything he'd always carried and something new he was still learning the weight of. And the empire built on fear was gone, and Naomi Carter's name was in the official record, and the work that remained was long and undramatic and real. And he was, as he'd told her at the graveside, okay. Not perfect, not finished, not without the cost of what it had taken to get here. But okay, that was enough to keep moving with. And he moved,